chair is missing. Oh, we're gonna sit this by ourselves.
Yeah, it's just us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just us. Yeah, just us in this interesting, experimental, rather slightly strange situation. It's funny, it's one of the things I was kind of just chatting to Angelica about, we're thinking about on the way here as well, is that despite the fact that it's kind of without an audience and in private, there also is an audience, and I'm, that the encouraged to speak freely and be experimental, and how we relate to that with the fact that we're also being recorded, and this kind of, it's potentially something that will be published, even if it might be in a redacted form, as I kind of understand, and in consultation, I've been assured by Sam, in consultation with us. So yeah, I was thinking that maybe that would be something we could reflect on. I know that from what Sam said, the space was quite important for Lara as well. So the kind of form of the event, the space. I mean, we have these keywords, and no doubt we will get onto those as well. I mean, that's what's structuring it. But yeah, the kind of the qualities of the event itself. I mean, this is, I think one of the things Lara said was being, trying to push people beyond their kind of comfort zone, and I think the way they think. But also, this is certainly something that puts me outside of my comfort zone. I thought I'd register that right at the beginning. Yeah, but in a good way, It's a kind of I'm excited, nervous, rather than like petrified by the situation. It's
but Lara is really not coming today?
No.
Really?
Yeah, the artist is not going to be here. That is.
Are we recording? Is the artist
this is on?
Right.
Right. Oh, I didn't get that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe I think, we should just start with a kind of reflect a little on, I suppose, go around, just sort of introduce ourselves a little bit, reflect a little bit on our initial impressions of this, and maybe think about an early sense of how this notion of opacity relates to our own work, or what did we understand by it. That might be a kind of just an easy way in to start. So I'm quite happy to go first, I suppose.
I can go first as well if take some of the pressure off. Either way.
Well, I mean, I'm going to keep it quite short, I think, in a way. I think one of the reasons why I'm here is because I ran a series of study sessions at Nottingham Contemporary in the summer that was based around the idea of the politics of opacity, which connects to my research. And I co-facilitated, I brought some people up, and we discussed various ideas around opacity, about clandestinity, invisibility, sort of cognate concepts, I suppose. And so my relationship to opacity as a kind of broad category comes through two things. One is my research focus is around the concept of anonymity, but specifically trying to understand it not as the way it's understood largely in kind of online communication as a way of protecting oneself, but actually as something that has a critical relation to the production of subjectivity. So an aesthetics of anonymity is a kind of ideas that I'm trying to kind of think about, rather than this kind of idea of masking for protection as masking for transformation, or masking for kind of some sort of central aesthetic quality, I think. So that's my kind of, and one other thing as well, the kind of opacity as I sort of understand it really comes from Martinican poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant, who talks about opacity as a kind of onto-ethical, so ontological and ethical condition of being human, and actually speaks about the idea of transparency or transparence, and the idea of something being knowable as a very kind of imperial, colonial concept that was, Enlightenment based, but also, so in the post-colonial context with which she's writing, there's this idea of casting knowability over the colonial subject, which was a violence to the inherent opacity of human relations. And so I'm interested in it from that kind of ethical, political position, that opacity is something that is a kind of condition of human relations, and that actually kind of the imperial project, and particularly think about today's society as a society that's very much based around the idea of everything being rendered transparent as a kind of violence of power in a way. but I'm also very aware that there are certain types of transparency that I think are important, like potentially institutional transparency as a kind of counter perspective. So I suppose, yeah, that's my kind of brief sort of, this is why I'm here and what I'm interested in. So yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, go.
Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of what you've just said kind of resonates on some level with my own work or just interests in general, but I think I come at it from a completely different angle, and in kind of preparation of for today, I was just trying to just have a broad think about opacity and how it applies to my work, and why exactly I was here, and I think I might have just figured it out. There are really two ways that I could think about opacity, and the first one, maybe the more literal one, is to do with its kind of visual property, opacity, something that doesn't let a lot of light go through. And I was trying to sort of take this as literally as I could and see whether it applied to my work at all. And I could think of, I'm just going on a big rumble, so if you want to stop me, just
good.
Stop me. I work on audio description. I don't know if you're familiar with audio description. So, are you familiar with audio description? To an extent. And when you write audio description, you're trying to cater for a broad spectrum of people with visual impairments, including people who may see some of the light. The light may make an impression on them, but who don't quite see the contours of shapes, or don't see clearly what's going on, in this case, on the screen. And
I like the website Porn for the Blind.
Is there?
Yeah.
I've never come across it. I'll definitely look it up with my VPN on. And so the way I was trying to think about opacity is, when you said that something is opaque, you're also saying that there is probably some meaning behind this opacity. There is the assumption that there is something to understand, but that you're not too sure what it is and how you can access it. So there is information, but all that information that you're getting fails to convert into meaning. It's there, there's something there, it just doesn't make sense. And audio description is kind of a catalyst. You're helping those shapes, impressions that your audience sees on the screen actually make sense. You describe that someone is walking from the left, and then you can see a shape sort of appearing on the left of the screen, these kinds of things. So in that sense, I think the sort of distinction between information and meaning is very, it's from information theory. It's nothing new, but I thought it was interesting for me in this case. And the second sort of definition of opacity, which I think is already kind of metaphorical, is to do with the meaning of text. When you say that a text, whether it's a film or a text or a novel or any text in the broadest possible sense is opaque, means that there's something not immediately understandable about it. And in the context of my own research, it's the word transparency, actually, that comes back the most often. Not the word opaque necessarily, but I think there is a relationship with what you mentioned earlier there, David. So I published a book that came out in June. I'm just bringing my own trumpet. I make it sound like I publish books every year. I don't. It's my first book, my first and only. And it's about the subtitling of African American vernacular English into French. And the last chapter is the more conceptual chapter, is about a translation studies scholar, who's called Lawrence Venuti. You may or may not have heard of him. No. And he published a book in the mid-90s which is entitled The Invisibility of the Translator. translator's invisibility, actually. I have to get this right. And in which he talks about the way, in particular, the ways that translation have to be invisible in order to be acceptable. So if you notice that something is a translation, then it has failed, essentially. And he opens his book with a quote by Shapiro, which is quite eloquent. Shapiro says that translation should be like a pane of glass. If you start noticing the little bubbles and imperfections, this is where you have a problem. And Venuti completely disagrees with this, actually. He says that it's a shame that we're hiding the fact of translation, that we should find ways to make it more, well, visible. And that this hegemony of transparency is a reflection of what he calls a xenophobic attitude at home. He's talking from a very Anglo-American perspective, and imperialism abroad. We have to appropriate everything that's from outside of our culture and turn it into our own. And so he disagrees with that, and in disagreeing with this, in a way, I suppose he's advocating for bringing back some form of opacity, although he never uses the word. I don't think so. But in this case, it would be a meaningful kind of opacity. So it goes against the definition I was thinking of earlier when I said that opacity has information but no meaning. For him, if you bring back this opacity straight away, it's there for a reason, and therefore you can attach a kind of meaning to it. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. I have no way of reconciling these two kind of opposing ideas, but I thought it might.
No, for sure. Yeah.
Right. I mean, for me, I'm going to talk about transparency and opacity on a sort of level of political organising and organisation, firstly with regards to kind of my own work and the uses of it, and then more generally. In terms of my own writing about like transgender subjects and transgender living, I mean, my approach was very much fostered by an awareness that I live in a society in which there's an awful lot of prejudice against like transgender people, and a lot of that was founded on just kind of like ignorance, but not just ignorance due to a complete lack of discussion about the subject, but ignorance due to just a huge level of like misinformation and people outside of the sort of trans community, deliberately spreading kind of misinformation, sensationalising the subject, or just outright lying about it in the knowledge that they weren't likely to be seriously challenged. And really what struck me as the most likely kind of effective counter to that was a sort of open and transparent trans-led conversation about the realities of our lives, using my own life as a kind of springboard for that. And as a tactic, that definitely had its uses. From a sort of personal well-being point of view, there was still a need to think carefully about which things you give away and which things you retain, because obviously once you make something open, you can't close it again. You've given it away. That's that. So that was a very kind of complicated process, and something that was formed by that sort of political precept that I had. I remember reading in about 2001, 2002, when I was a student, that a big problem for transgender people in politics was the apparent impossibility of making outsiders understand what our life experiences were like. So I thought, well, I'm going to test that hypothesis with kind of limited results. One of the problems with that sort of transparency is obviously you open up to a kind of community. You say to people who are kind of isolated, look, there are many more of you, and there are resources, and there are people, and there is support, all of which is great. But obviously you open up to your kind of enemies, you know, kind of key points of attack. You know, you give your enemies a better understanding of you as well, which, you know, you as you will win some people over, you know, you give other people targets, as it were. So working out what to make transparent and what to keep opaque is just a kind of trial and error process, really. And I find that interesting with regards to wider attitudes to sort of politics and the politics of information. You know, obviously the kind of emergence of WikiLeaks in the early part of this decade, and, you know, its collapse into kind of infighting and you know, sort of cult of personality around Julian Assange, and everything was kind of dispiriting, although it's not a political project that I ever placed, you know, any great amount of kind of hope or faith in. And one of the most interesting conversations I had about WikiLeaks was with a friend who just said, look, it's a very neoliberal project in regards as, you know, it feels like it has a quite market-driven impulse at its core, in that you kind of put as much of the truth out there as possible, and then the sort of marketplace of ideas sort of, you know, sorts it out. Just generally tended not to be the case, actually. They put out all of this information, and there's kind of so much of it that lots of people are just like, well, there's far too much to go through here. The media then will edit that for people, but they'll edit it in a way that's either ideologically expedient, i.e. by just kind of flagging up things that aren't particularly interesting in the hope that the public will bore with the story. With regards to that, I'm kind of thinking about the redacted Prince Charles letters that were published a year or two ago that had been kept out of the news for a long time because judges had said they were too much in the public interest, you know, either the monarchy interfering in democratic politics. And when they were released, the bits that were reported were incredibly dull. And everyone was just like, well, I don't care if, you know, Prince Charles has an opinion on gardening or something. It's not really interesting. And with WikiLeaks, a similar kind of thing happened. You know, a lot of the leaks were kind of along the lines of American diplomat says something derogatory about North Korea in private. So, well, of course they do. I'm not surprised by that. So with regards to making things transparent, and keeping things opaque, I think in order for that to be a politically effective strategy, it has to be very, very targeted. And even then, you have to accept that once you make things transparent, you know, you do relinquish some control over them, and you put things out into the world, and you don't know what's going to happen to them. So I find that very interesting. And I mean, obviously, as a way of contrast, kind of opaque organisations, you know, are a huge problem politically as well. Organisations that, you know, deliberately bend or distort or withhold information about their own activities. You know, reminded of Tony Benn's sort of principles for political organisations, and one of them is, you know, this question of with any political organisation, it needs to be kind of reasonably obvious an answer to the question of like, well, who are you and how do we get rid of you if we need to get rid of you? And obviously most political organisations don't make that clear for fairly obvious reasons. So I find that very interesting as well. So yeah, I find the I guess the role of transparency and opacity in political activism quite interesting. Maybe I'm coming at it from a quite situationist perspective, but yeah, that's my initial reaction to the topic.
Sure, good. Yeah, I will follow your thread with the WikiLeaks by starting from a magazine I've been reading sometime, which is the Al Qaeda magazine, which was called Inspire.
Right.
It was published. They started to publish it around 2009, 2010, something like that. And they had a very interesting section which was called Open Source Jihad. The magazine the magazine layout was more or less like magazine you could find in the Western societies, with a section about high tech, section about health, like how to get shape without weight, for instance, while you're in the mountain, etc., etc. But they had this section in the middle of the magazine which was called Open Source Jihad, and they made a point related to what you were saying. They were saying that, in fact, you could oppose secrecy and opacity. Secrecy is an old model. You have to, when you set up an operation, a military operation, or a terrorist operation, well, you have to be very careful. First you have to train people to set up a group, and it takes time, it takes resources, but all the time you have somebody who talks too much, or who's a double agent, and everything collapses, and you have to redo it again, and it's 4 extra years to reset up everything. So they said, that doesn't work anymore. Instead of trying to keep secret everything we do, let's make it public. So we're going to publish everything about us. And that's what this open source jihad section is about. So they tell everything about their way of thinking, about the instruments they use, about their strategy. They publish everything. And they say, you see, it's like WikiLeaks, in fact. There are so much information that, in fact, people don't know what to read and how to look through inside. So when we will publish recipes about how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mum with 3 potatoes and a clock, well, CIA or the Russian intelligence service, they already know about that. So it won't teach us anything. It won't teach them, anything. But for other people who don't have this knowledge, it will be very helpful. There will be many more information than little tricks, but it will be lost in an ocean of data. And in fact, in order to be able to know what are the relevant information, you need certain glasses. And we could call these glasses an aspectual vision in a Wittgenstein term. Like, the same drawing can be seen either as a rabbit or as a duck. So from this ocean of data, you can see just an ocean and nothing else, or you can see patterns. And in order to be able to distinguish, to see the patterns, you need, in fact, a certain perspective. And what means to have a certain perspective? It's, in fact, to know the keywords, to know a minimum of the language. And in fact, knowing a minimum of the language means to belong to a group, which means that the vision is connected to a community. If you belong, or if you're in the process of belonging to a group, suddenly you will get the language of the group. Suddenly you will be able to see forms or shapes in a foggy or overwhelming data substrate. So I thought it was interesting, this opposition between secrecy and opacity. The opacity is not connected to secret. The opacity is connected to publicity. The second thing, so it goes also in your direction, because making everything public and making everything opaque is connected, but it also has something to do with the ecosystem of things and with the structure or the infrastructure of things. I was struck 10 minutes ago when I realized that the artist wouldn't be present. And it struck me for this reason, is that I can understand the reason of the setup, let's say. I can also understand the shape of this event today, because in fact it's very common in the art world to have things like that. So let's say it's a classic format. You don't know anything about what is going to happen, but you set up a situation where it can happen.
Yeah.
However, it's not a self-generating event. The opacity of this format is not self-generated. It has been processed and produced by an institution, by a team. And Sam and Angelica were saying before that it took them a lot of work. It took them a huge amount of energy, and etc., etc. What I find interesting is that you could perfectly keep the opacity of this format while being more transparent about the process itself. But here, even the process is considered as secret. We don't know how they selected the guest. They did not communicate at all about all the sequences of work that has happened since the beginning. And that has, this is a little bit, I wouldn't say disturbing because it's too strong, it's okay. But I'm wondering if it would not bring something to the project to be more explicit about the process of sending up an opaque event. And it comes back to what you were saying, that opacity is sometimes something to protect a form of life, let's say. It's not always obvious that we should make everything transparent. And some practices need this opacity to be protected. Some practices are jeopardized by light or by transparency. But in an artwork or in an art project, I feel the opacity has to be connected with the publicity. It doesn't matter. I mean, it can be public and opaque at the same time. However, giving access to the process of the making doesn't jeopardize, doesn't endanger the artwork. For me, it's even necessary. So it can be debated, it can be used, it can be understood by the public it produces. If you don't have access to it, you just put a stone in the middle and you say, okay, people, deal with that.
The conspiracy theorist in me thinks that this is precisely what we've been put here for, and that's precisely what's happening. That what do we have all in common? You know, we've got this process, and now we're talking about this process.
Yeah,
it seems to be kind of self-reflexive, a meta exercise.
It's a script. Okay, we have a script, and we don't know each other, and we hold together just through the script. Like spend a day together talking.
Yeah.
It's fine. I mean, it's like a music score. Musicians don't know each other before they meet for the rehearsal, and they get along, or they play together. We don't need to know each other before.
It's kind of aleatoric.
Yeah.
Music score maybe, makes it sound overly scripted, I think. But yeah, you know, it sort of
Or
feels like
you can have open-ended.
John Cage sort of just prescription
but
for performers or something.
Yeah, I mean, you have
hopefully
all
won't be
sorts
too
of
much
music
silence,
score.
but yeah.
You have very loose, very
Yeah.
vague scores. But still, I mean, it's not unexpected to have a score or a script which produce a group like today. But I would have expected a little more, let's say, access to the process of the making. It for me, it doesn't weaken the project itself.
I mean, I think I mentioned before when we were having tea that one of my kind of reflections on this, when Sam framed this as a kind of like anti-panel discussion, and when, you know, the panel discussions become a fixture of cultural institutions, but, you know, it's not got a public audience in that regard, and, you know, there's a kind of opacity to, you know, and also this kind of like hyper information that you're speaking about as rendering things opaque. I don't know about you, but when I was faced with all those keywords, I was like, well, I mean, you know, that's potentially an infinite combination of things that you can connect those. It's almost like you need a certain lens to be able to read that data in a way. But this kind of idea of a sort of anti-panel discussion seems to me to have an element of kind of institutional critique attached to it. But of course, one of the principal parts of the art movement or the understanding within the art world about institutional critique was that it rendered the functioning, the process of the institution transparent. So, I mean, I agree. I think you can keep the opacity of an event and also, render transparent the processes that lead up to it. So, I mean, one of my friends asked me last night when I mentioned I was doing this, like, well, this seems a bit strange. You don't know anything about the process. So, are you all getting paid the same, for example? Like, certain questions like this, we don't need to necessarily answer or whatever, but these were the things that he was thinking about.
He's right.
And I think it's interesting that I do agree. I don't think you don't necessarily have to have one and not the other. Yeah. They're not diametrically opposed. I think they're in tension with each other, opacity, and that's what I picked up from what everybody was saying, that there's clearly a tension between these two terms, transparency and opacity. But it doesn't mean that you can have one and not. You don't have to. You can have them in a certain degree at the same time, and it still functions. So yeah.
It's what I consider to be the ecology of an artwork. When you have, let's say, 2 or 3 monochromes from 3 different painters, they are not the same objects. And the Leibovici monochrome is not a Yves Klein monochrome. Yeah. Or Reimann monochrome, or Manzoni monochrome, or Adrenard monochrome, and you can make the difference because you know the trajectory of the painters, and you know their other works, and you know their practice, and they have obviously different practices. So to go back to the expression you were using about opacifying the interpretation, I mean, if we have the mediations of the artwork, the practices of the artwork invisible or transparent, we are still in a very modernist approach. If we make the mediations opaque, which means visible in fact, it makes a big difference, because when you point something opaque, it doesn't mean that you understand everything about it, but you know it exists. And it's a big difference. You know, it's like in the military service. When they do their military archives, it's a big difference between erasing a file and letting the file existing and put it top secret on it. So you know it's not public, you cannot have access to it, but you know it's there. So in 10, 30, 50 years, 100 years, somebody will have access to it. But it's in the index. So it's in the list of the components of the thing. And here we don't know anything about the index. We don't know who are the actors. We don't know how much of time, of exercise, of resources it took them. And for me, it's a pity.
Well, I've always been very attracted to art, broader sense, that wears the processes of its construction on the outside. And I'm thinking here of anything from, say, like the stand-up comedian Stuart Lee, who's very kind of upfront about the way he uses language, the way he constructs jokes, and kind of a lot of his humour comes from kind of, just explicating the processes behind coming up with the punchline. Or I'm thinking about like some of the bands that were around in the post-punk era, like particularly Scritti Politti, like very early on. Their record sleeves would just print the entire process of like recording and releasing a record, like all the people and process that fed into that. But I remember reading the really good music critic Simon Reynolds. He wrote about, I think he was writing about Scritti, and he said the problem with this sort of demystification is that it's very interesting, but there's nowhere to go after. And this idea that if you demystify all of your processes, you leave your audience in just a kind of like an open space, I think, and it can leave you feeling a bit stranded, I think.
What is an open space?
Well, I think, or like a sort of a blank space, I guess, like, to demystify a space is, I think, to sort of conceptually kind of clear it. mythologies and mysteries are a lot of the things that I think culture is built on, that artists kind of respond to, and yeah, I mean, I do wonder if he's right that this process of demystification, if you make everything too clear.
But clear doesn't mean dessert. You said dessert in English and dessert.
Oh, yeah, dessert. Yeah.
Dessert.
Pudding.
Because in fact, I would say it's not a blank space. It's a more populated space. We are 4, but to set up this event, there were at least 4, 5, 6 other people who had to work around the table, and so we would be already 10. And probably if there are other open tables like that, we will be 30. So I would say it's a more populated space, and we have to negotiate with more people than to be just by yourself popping up like that.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in what you were talking about earlier, and I'd like to perhaps bring the discussion back to that a bit, what you were talking about with kind of open source you had, and this idea of just putting out so much information that, the problem becomes for the people at the other end, working in the assumption that everything you say and do is going to be monitored, and that you can take control of that by making information public yourself. And it becomes a political tool, kind of surfeit of information, acting as a weapon of kind of confusion. And in particular, I'm thinking of the way that Vladislav Surkov, who's very involved with the Putin government, took these sort of techniques from kind of relatively underground art collectives like the Voyna Collective in Russia, and made it a kind of an aspect of government policy to just put out all sorts of conflicting information about what the Putin government is doing, to the point where it's impossible to pass. There's just so much there. Metahaven responded to this really well with their film The Sprawl last year, which looks at things like this kind of army of kind of trolls, kind of working in these sort of like these Russian content labs, and kind of generating this air of kind of paranoia with their existence. The problem doesn't become so much what information are they putting out, because that becomes almost meaningless. The problem becomes like, why are they doing this? What do they want? Because with that amount of information, the underlying motives become pretty much impossible to work out.
Yeah, it's impossible to work out, but also it generates very various forms of public, of collective. To go back to this example, the title of the first issue of the magazine was "How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mum," and of course, intelligence service know that, but it means that for individuals who don't know that, then it becomes possible to do it. Then you have other data saying something or teaching something more, which requires more skills. So you produce a second level of audience or of public or of activists, and so on and so far. So which means that by publishing so much information, you're generating various groups, unexpected groups, because you don't know, you don't monitor anymore the production of the groups. You let it to the will of individuals, or it's a self-organization. So you have professional organizations which will be able to rely on a certain group of data, and individuals who have nothing to do with that, who don't have experience, who are really what we call in French bras cassés, broken arm, because they're really not handy. They want to do a terrorist action, but then they didn't check the car, and the car gets broken on the road. And it really happens when you look at the archives of the history of terrorist groups. It happens all the time. They didn't put gas, the engine broke, There is a strike on this very day, etc., etc. So you accept not to be able to control the audience, to control the public anymore. So it's also another understanding of what mean of a production. The historical model is you have the producers and then you have the public. And with this overflow model, it's a continuous line. In fact, you cannot tell anymore who are the producers and who are the consumers or the audience, because in fact the public is the producer also.
Which is a very kind of which fits in with the idea of a kind of networked world of decentered power, and also as a kind of, I mean, thinking about a sort of as a kind of resistance to dominant power centres. That's also something that's very, very difficult to manage, because where do you look? I mean, you know, there's a centralised organisation where something is produced perhaps in secret and then eventually reveals itself from concealment through an action, which might be because I'm thinking back to what you were saying about the idea of political organisations in secret, in kind of secret societies, and that might sort of render themselves visible through an action or a kind of proclamation or something. That model of sort of, you know, concealment revelation has completely gone. I mean, where do you look? I mean, you need to also have the lens that is perhaps what is kept secret in a way to read this kind of thing, and that's something that's very difficult to
either they are kept secret or they are produced
or continually.
They are produced through the production of the groups. It's the groups who produce their own glasses
exactly.
according to the situation, the local situation, according to their needs, to their agenda. You don't know how the elements are going to be connected. You have a huge amount of data and you have to find a way to collect them. But the techniques to connect those data is the production of the group itself.
Absolutely.
But the important, bits in the mass of information, the mass of data that is available in the context of open source jihad, for instance, this only comes to light when some of these things that are mentioned are actually realized. That when they become acted upon, they also become demystified. That was important, but it's like you can only know after the act is committed what was actually relevant in the mass of data.
Yeah, you're right.
So you're always one step behind the game.
Yes, I mean that's true for the institutions. For instance, when this magazine was released, Guardian wrote a paper saying it was a fake. It was probably published by intelligence service to make fun of those groups. But when there was a Boston Marathon attack by the two Chechen teenagers, and they found this issue in their bedroom, they realized that they had to take it more seriously. So that's true for the institution, but I would say for academics, for scholars, or for artists who are trained to see the potentialities of models in advance, because we don't have to pay the price of changing big infrastructures. We are also more sensitive to that, so we can maybe pre-feel.
Yeah.
You say pre-feel in English?
Preempt, I think.
Pressentir.
Yeah.
Preempt the possibility of something.
Then there is an element of gambling. Maybe you sense that there is something there, that the potentiality exists.
Yeah.
But it's still reliant on people.
Yeah, you're right.
Taking over.
It's also a question of weight. When you're by yourself, you're lighter when you're a state, or when you're a big corporation. Because when you're a big being, it's harder to move. It takes more time,
Big turning circle. Yeah.
and it's more expensive also to make a little change. So the smaller you are, the faster, and you, as you say, always one strike,
One step ahead of the game.
a
Yeah.
step ahead. Yeah. So it tells also something about scale
Mm-hmm.
for political action. Small scales are always, I wouldn't say better, but sometimes more efficient, maybe. At least for a certain time, for a certain period of time.
I mean, I wanted to come back a little bit. Now, it seems we were talking about sort of political organising and political groups, and the idea that you brought up, Juliet, about Ben talking about how political groups should be transparent in order that we have the capabilities to get rid of them or whatever. That's very much thinking a kind of a democratic voter democratic kind of system. But there's something that I read about recently where someone wrote that when in a kind of condition of total transparency, that the idea of political time and action changes because you don't have that time away from a kind of exposure to scrutiny or whatever, to plot and to plan and for ideas to change and to be forged. And so there's something about, I just picking up on this idea of this kind of like total visibility or total transparency or hyper-information and the temporal connection as well. That seemed to come out in what you were saying that I thought we could maybe explore in a way as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's interested me with regards to the rise of kind of the alt-right in the US. And, obviously their noted support for Donald Trump, and everything was out in the open if you knew it was out in the open. There's a difference between something being in public and people actually looking at it. And the way the alt-right kind of organised was to use sort of forums like 4chan in particular. They used quite a lot, Reddit to an extent, but primarily 4chan. And they have these alt-right groups, and they communicate through these sort of memes, which were kind of ironic and not ironic at the same time. So there's sort of hiding in plain sight, and of course lots of people just thought, oh, they're just a bunch of like stupid, horrible right-wing kids, and just ignored them. And all the time these people were working out on through discussions on these forums, and it's all still there. Their tactics, they understood that their politics were sort of in some ways taboo. I mean, in lots of ways not. You hear a lot from right-wing people saying, oh, we're not allowed to talk about immigration, no one's allowed to talk about immigration, and meanwhile you go into any newsagent, the front page of every right-wing newspaper is nothing but that topic. But they sort of understood that in sort of quote-unquote polite society, people disapproved of their opinions, and so a key part of their tactics were to say, look, don't tell people how you intend to vote, don't be open about your politics, in kind of, with kind of normies, quote unquote. But they would have this sort of secret, not secret space where they kind of organised, and nobody really realised what they were doing until it was too late. And, now there's this huge upsurge of far right activity, including neo-Nazis in the White House. As a result of that kind of mode of organising. I mean, I think it's more difficult for the left and kind of radical left, because the radical left has always had a tendency to really wear all of its kind of disagreements on its kind of sleeve, and you'll see very public forums like Twitter, and, it's not hard for people who are ideologically opposed to the radical left to find examples of the radical left kind of tearing themselves apart, and the same scrutiny isn't given to the far right because people expect them to be more kind of opaque, I think, and so aren't really looking into them. I don't know.
I think it takes us back to something that you mentioned at the beginning, Frank, to do with community and networks forming as a result of this kind of open source jihadism. Here we've got existing communities and existing networks, and it seems that these manifestations are a way of reinforcing actually membership to a particular group, to a particular community, or to reinforce the bonds between the different members of that community. Like to go back to your point, do the communities form through open source jihadism, or is there something like a core shared element that's there to begin with, and then the kind of material helps crystallize that element and maybe give a clearer shape or contour to the community?
Well, it depends on the situations, but for this specific topic, what I noticed by going through the chat rooms and the forums is that they are very heterogeneous.
I was going to say, actually, sorry, I'm just cutting you off. I was going to mention my own Facebook feed, which is completely sanitized, probably partly through my own actions, but they're not deliberate. I'm not deliberately trying to sanitize my own Facebook, because if you look at my Facebook wall, it's all lefties, I suppose. But it's not really through my own actions. It's like there is a kind of, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is it sanitizes itself, it seems.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, it's 4 or 5 years ago with Sam. I was presenting a piece about let's say propaganda songs that you can find on YouTube. And when you look at the lyrics, they are terrible. But once again, those songs don't pop up self-generated. They are composed by composers, they are performed by musicians, they are recorded in music studios, even if it's a basic one like this, and they are broadcasted and they are traded. And the place where they are traded are the forums and the chat rooms. And when you have a look at the conversations, you realize this heterogeneity. For instance, I remember one guy writing, please don't send me war songs which have instruments, because instruments are forbidden in Islam, so I only accept choir, a cappella songs. With a little drumming, but I mean it's debated, so mostly voices, and if you want drums. Nobody answered, and 3 days later he wrote back and he wrote, was kidding, lol, send everything you want. So you see the level of the norm, of normativity, is very flexible. The guy is trying something, it doesn't work, so he said, okay, I'm more flexible, you can send war song with instruments. Another guy wrote, oh, I love those songs from Bosnia and Kosovo. I wish I would understand what they mean. Which was very surprising for me, because you're trading war song because of the content. And suddenly, like a good French guy singing English songs without understanding a word of the English song, the guy was saying that he doesn't have access to the meaning of the song. So you see, you have this group of people who are here for different reasons. They are not all strictly oriented with one agenda. Of course, the little core group which will do the military operation will be more determined, and they will have a stricter agenda. But inside a group you have different groups, and this is very loose. You have people who enter, people who go out, people who stay. Depends on which platform of visibility you're using. If you're using a chat or a forum, it's very loose. If you're using a site of operation, it's smaller and tougher. It depends on when and where you look at.
It's interesting that we've come back to this word about visibility as well, because what struck me from the conversation as well so far is that we're definitely kind of talking about opacity and trying to think about opacity, and certainly and definitely saying this is not about invisibility or about not being visible, being rendered invisible. And I found that struck me actually when you were talking, Alex, about the idea of introducing a certain type of opacity or kind of a granular nature to translation that was actually making something visible, rather than, because I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, or when you mention the word opaque or opacity in common parlance, people tend to think about it as something that stops light passing through, so therefore becomes a form of, or a scale towards absolute invisibility. And what we're most definitely saying here is that opacity is not about necessarily being invisible. In fact, we can have a hypervisibility that renders something opaque, and I think that's actually a really important
cinema.
conceptual. Yeah, absolutely.
Projection of light on the wall or on the screen.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really really important point. And just as something like a pure transparency can actually render things completely and utterly invisible as well. So actually, when we think about these in conceptual terms, often the commonplace or common parlance understanding of these words is actually rendered insignificant, or not insignificant, but plainly incorrect, I think. And I think that's quite an important thing, and points to a sense of tension, I think, that's come through a lot of these things as well. There's always a kind of, I'm going to go back to sort of that kind of sense of a sort of a political tension as well, what to reveal, what to conceal, or the idea that there's a certain scale about political efficacy that needs to be negotiated. And I think there's something interesting talking about that as well, about how we're actually thinking about the way that you talked about a continuum in terms of how not just there isn't like this pair of glasses that pre-exist that we can put on to see, but these glasses are produced in the moment. And I don't kind of know where I'm going with this. I've lost my sort of thread a wee bit. But this idea of a sort of tension between different registers of transparency and opacity, and also a kind of like temporal scale, I suppose, interests me. I'm going to kind of stop there because I think that I've just confused things in a way.
Transparency is something that can be fantasized, I think, as well. I'll try and give you an example from my own field. I don't know if you've ever heard of the legend of the Septuagint, which is so it's a religious text. It's part of the Old Testament. And it was the Pharaoh of Egypt. It was, I think, Ptolemy II, but you don't want to quote me on that. No, it's on tape, there you go.
Too late.
Who wanted to commission a translation of the Old Testament for the Jewish communities who were living in Egypt at the time. So, quite nice. And so what he did, I think there were 6 or 7 tribes, and he took 12 scholars from all the different tribes, and he put them all in different rooms, and he asked them to translate the Old Testament. And you can maybe guess what happened and why this is called legend. They all came up with the exact same translation. Wow! Because of course, the words of the original are so transparent, I suppose, or unambiguous, that of course they all came up with the exact same translation, which is kind of laughable, because if you've got any experience of translation at all, even very basic, you know that this is not going to happen, and it's just a strategy to give more strength to the original and also to the translation, and to make the translation appear like it's something that is really, well, authoritative, okay, or like it has the same author as the original. And you find that kind of issues a lot. They still crop up in kind of more or less hidden ways with religious texts in particular, because of the need for, you know, this kind of transparency, this kind of the meaning there it has to be unambiguous, otherwise we have a problem. What do we do? If it's fuzzy, what do we follow? It can't be opaque. There has to be one single meaning. To the point that when you translate certain religious text and you look at the translations, they don't say that they're a translation of the Quran, for instance, but it would say that it's a translation of the words of, as a kind of disclaimer almost, saying, look, we're just giving you the words. You do whatever you want with them. We're kind of not taking responsibility here.
I'm interested to, when I talked about something about, like, you know, hypervisibility being opaque, something that's opaque as well, you mentioned cinema. And I've been thinking about the photographic as well. I mean, particularly this idea of sort of people going into one room and translating something that's coming out the same. The idea that the photograph, for example, is this long-standing idea, there's this slice of reality, that it's, you know, it's transparent reality. And yet, if you were to give 50 people the same camera and ask them to photograph the same object in the middle of the table, you would have 50 different photographs. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you meant when you were talking about the idea of cinema and that kind of that dynamic there, because I'm just interested to hear what you've got to say, to be honest.
Well, I don't know if I can elaborate on that. I was just reacting.
Okay, cool.
It's because, if you just have a light flux without something to stop it, then you don't see anything. It's this transparency model. So you need the screen.
Yeah.
You need an opacity to be able to see something. In fact, and that's why I was saying, I was taking your quote, which was opacify the mediations. I think for the next tables, we should have all the people involved in the project, even if they remain silent. I mean, Angelica and Sam could be here, sitting on a chair and listening, and all the other people involved. The project would still be opaque, but then we would see the mediations. It's like when the interpretation or the translation you were talking about, that the translator or the interpreter is not supposed to be to manifest his presence or her presence. It's, for instance, when in a trial a witness is laughing or is crying, it is considered very inappropriate that the translator starts to laugh or to cry. So they just keep one feature of the discursive object. So don't keep everything. Or when they just keep the semantic, let's say. But when they interrupt the chain of translation, saying there is a problem because the witness said this and that and it could have two meanings, it is both considered as a problem because the interpreter should not be interfering, but at the same time it's a way to enrich the conversation, and I would say more to enrich, to save the trial, because if they choose the wrong meaning, then it can be a problem. So it's the opacification, the opacifying the mediations are really, really important, in fact, for the sustainability of a project. The more mediations, the more opaque are made the mediations, the more sustainable, in fact, is the project, because it can last longer, because you can sustain, you can fix the mediations if there are problems somewhere. If you let them invisible, if somewhere it is collapsing, you won't know where. So opacifying the mediation is really a key point, I think.
I I think I agree with that. It seems though to be going against the way that Western society operates at the moment, where processes and mediations are, we're always trying to explain them and to fix them, to provide a kind of legal framework for them in order to it's interesting because we're doing that to gain some protection as well. Like if you don't follow the letter of the law, then you put yourself in trouble, and then it's your fault. So it's a way of attributing responsibility as well. Whereas if the mediation is opaque, then you can't do that. It's just opaque, and then we need to fix the situation rather than point the finger and say, well, someone made a mistake here. It's their fault. So it seems that opacity here is a way of maybe not falling into this kind of pitfalls.
I mean, that also strikes me in a sense there about this idea of kind of codification. I mean, in terms of law and structures to kind of codify things that can therefore be referred to in terms of that, rather than that fits with a kind of. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning Edouard Glissant's idea of opacity, and as not being this kind of invisibility, but this kind of condition of the impossibility of total knowability, and actually that as a kind of political or the political project of the Enlightenment, the imperial project of colonialism, etc., to try and render everything knowable and accessible is also a process of kind of codification of knowledge as well, and of structuring things by categorization, which goes against what Glissant would argue is the very inherent kind of, I hesitate to use the word nature, I think more a relational condition is how he would think it, that actually that is at the core. And so, for what you're saying there is that, you see this more and more and more things trying to be rendered completely transparent and codified. And I think about this in terms of the body, and biometrics is a really interesting one. Yeah. But actually, written into these biometric technologies are also conditions of racism and sexism, which I was reading about in a really interesting way. That there's a video on YouTube of facial recognition software, and there's a guy in a store, African American guy, and he's kind of like, look at this, moving his head around like this, and he says, I'm just going to bring in my colleague Wendy, my white colleague Wendy. And Wendy comes in, and the camera starts moving, following her face, and so the algorithms can't see black skin. So there's this kind of in this process towards this kind of total transparency through technology and in the body, we often forget that these kind of signatures of that kind of imperial project, that violence, that codification are written into them. And I don't know, I find that...
Oh, I want to reassure you. I'm sure that the surveillance camera will be soon able to monitor blackface.
They're calibrated differently.
Yeah, so they will manage.
but it's something that doesn't, I think, that doesn't often...
Yeah, it's to go in your current that opacity can be a tool for let's say social fight or social struggle, resistance. I have a little story that I don't know if you know this artist called Agency, Agence, who's based in Brussels, who work on, to be in a nutshell, work on the split between nature and culture through law. And he was pointing a case where there is a tribe in Australia, an Aboriginal tribe, who was studied by a British anthropologist. Let's say, I would say, in 30s, 40s, I would say. And he asked to have access to their secret cave, because in their secret cave there was a mapping of the whole area where the water sources were. And the access of this cave was also regulated inside the group, because you could not have access to it before you would turn 40 years old.
Okay.
So it was both important, not only for the tribe in regard to the other tribes, because if the other tribe had access to this map, it could, for instance, poison the sources, or it could control the sources, and if there was a war, it would be a weakness for this tribe to not to be in control of water supply anymore. And it was also important inside the group, because it would make the difference between people under 40 or beyond 40 years old in terms of hierarchy and political position. So the anthropologists asked to have access to it, and the tribe said, okay, but you have to swear not to publish the map. We can show it to you, we can explain you how it works, but promise you won't publish it. Sure, I won't publish it. So he studied it, then he came back to England, he did his career, and when he was about retiring, he said, that field study I did like 40 years ago, that was really the peak, in fact, of my research. I should do something about that. And he published the book, and on the first page of the book was a map. So what the Aboriginal tribe did was to sue the anthropologist. But the tribe cannot sue, because the tribe is not a legal person. So they decided they would turn into a legal person as the author of the map, as an artist. And they said, we are the author of the map, and we own the copyright of the map. So by publishing it without our consent, it's an infringement of copyright. And by this technique, which means by setting up a public legal point with, let's say, a legal innovation, because it was the first time a collective would turn into a persona, into a legal actor, as an author or as an artist. They were able to force the anthropologist to take out the publication of the book, at least in Australia. He was allowed to keep the book published in Great Britain, but at least in Australia, the youngsters had to go through Amazon to order it, which was possible but not obvious. So it was a way to protect, in fact, the tribe by this over-visibility, by reinstalling an opacity, but by making a public legal point. So the publicity, once again, doesn't go against the opacity. They go together, and it's the transparency which endanger the tribe. They have to make their point public to be protected, in fact. To preserve the opacity, in fact.
For sure. Yeah, and I think this is, I'm coming back to Glissant again, because, this is kind of, he really does structure my sort of understanding of this idea of opacity. And for him, the idea of you mentioned resistance, and, it's interesting thinking about, something like obscuring or obfuscation as a kind of like resistant technique that would render something opaque, particularly with information technology and things like that. But for Glissant, I don't think opacity is something that you try and generate, or it's something that is already there that we have to claim the right back to, that actually power in its particular kind of Western colonial imperial form has, its war is on this condition of relationality. And it strikes me that a lot of the examples that we've been speaking about, particularly this idea of sort of levels of visibility within groups, within open source jihad, how, you know, that speaks to that sense of opacity as at the core of the kind of relational condition of being human and social and social networks. And I think that's quite something that strikes me as important. It's not something that we kind of claim, it's not a mask that we put on. It's the fact that power tries to remove the mask in a way that is already inherent in those relations. And I think even though it's like quite a subtle shift, I think that's quite an important point when we think about the kind of a sort of violence of transparency.
I think it doesn't always do that successfully, though. The one example I'm thinking about is the U.S. census, for instance, where you have to check your race or ethnicity, you know, and you have to fall within certain categories, and these categories change with every census because they're never actually adequate, you know, because they always fail to account for this kind of in-between spaces, you know, because we are dealing with a continuum, and what it seems to be trying to do is purely for descriptive purposes. You know, we're trying to describe the U.S. population, so it falls under these broad headings, and as soon as you do that, you are trying to pick up, I think, on salient properties, and you're also sending a message. Look, these are the properties that are important, and then you're faced with a response. You know, whether people agree, yes, I identify as this or that, or people say, well, I don't identify as either this or that. I identify as something else. And by fixating these names, by having, you know, these labels, you also create the possibility for difference. Okay, it's only through this process of codification that difference can also be possible.
Yeah, I mean, I would.
But what's the which leads to? You were saying this because.
I was just about.
No, you were saying it's not always the time, but it's not always reacting to what you were saying about. I can't remember. No, because
the flow of my idea.
Because I don't see in which sense it contradicts or it opposes. I think I have the feeling it's exactly the same.
Yes.
What you're saying. I mean, you were saying it's not all the time the case, and
no, you by creating these labels, you're creating the possibility for difference.
Yes.
And
but
in doing so, you're trying to implement some kind of transparency, but you're kind of always failing because it's the implementation of that transparency that invites opacity, that invites the exploration of those in-between spaces.
Why do you see it as transparency and not more like glasses, like a perspective? Because you said yourself that it was changing every census.
Yes,
because
I think I see it as fixation. You know, you're trying to capture some kind of reality, and you're always failing to do that.
Yes, and it's because these categories will produce data, and by compiling this data, it will determine politics or policies, and funding, for instance, for minorities, etc., etc. But as you said, every census it changes. And because it's these categories are the result of civil struggles or social struggles. For instance, in Brazil, before they had just Caucasian, Black, and Indians, and at some point they asked people, okay, how would you describe yourself? And they got to more than 30 answers or 50 answers. You had such subtle differences, like I'm 1/8 black and 1/4 Indian and one. So they ended up to have 16 categories. And I think it was last year or 2 years ago, the government said, okay, 16 is too much. So we're going to reduce it to 4. And people started to protest because they considered that these 16 boxes were in fact civil rights, and it was a recognition of their identity. But it's a way, as you said, to make some issues salient, to make them visible. But I don't see it as an opposite. It doesn't make them transparent. It makes them on the opposite. Let's say more temporary stable.
I think it's trying to to give them some form of transparency, but I'm also saying it's always failing because whenever you're describing, you have to kind of identify what's important about something. If you describe, this glass, you're going to try and talk about its size, about its transparency, and so on and so forth. So you have to work with.
So by
kind of
transparent, you
contours
mean
and build.
naturalized? By transparent.
In what context?
In the context of census. By transparent, you're saying that they are try to be seen as natural categories which exist in the world and not as social construct.
Yes, which is why you end up with also the kind of discussions that you've got in the US on race and ethnicity, and why it's such it's a shifting ground, and why race and ethnicity haven't got a satisfactory.
Yeah, but that's why they cannot be considered
definition.
as transparent, because you cannot disconnect them to the debate and controversies you're talking about.
That's right. I think I'm talking from the perspective of the descriptor. So the state, the institution, the US government was trying to kind of apply some kind of template. Look, this is the American population. Tick a box.
But but at the same time, I don't know exactly who decide on the categories. If they are sociologists or universities, or I don't know exactly.
I'm not entirely sure. No.
Who's the board? That would be interesting.
Who comes up with the labels?
Yeah, and what's the process to decide the categories? But I'm not sure they are naive. I think they are very much aware of the
Well, they have to.
of the fights behind.
Which CNN,
So
but I mean, those categories produce subjects which can then be politically, economically manipulated. I mean, you said something that interests me because I have take a different perspective. You were talking about the idea of codification, or this kind of notion of categories, delineating something makes difference possible. I come from a perspective that actually difference precedes identity, so that difference is a state of pure difference, and then the process of identification of categories produces an identity. It's not that you have to have identity to then have difference. Difference exists, and from that difference, categories are produced, and that's a kind of. Well, it's Deleuze that spoke about this in the 1960s.
Well, Foucault as well, in the history of sexuality, kind of drives towards that point. There's just, in particular, there's a shift between just noticing behaviours and categorising identities. So, he talks about the shift between trying people for sodomy, which is, just like a sexual act. So there's sodomites, this is people who have engaged in sodomy as an act, and then, around about the time of the Oscar Wilde trials, late 19th century, there's been enough attention paid to, in thinking about kind of acts like sodomy, cross-dressing, etc., for people to start kind of formulating kind of categories of people who do these things. So you move from kind of doing to being. And then, identities come out of that, and categorization, and then, like you said earlier, there'll be a category. There was often, a case of like gender and sexuality was often imposed by the medical establishment. and people say, well, you are a homosexual or you are a transvestite or whatever, and then people think, well, no, that doesn't describe me actually, and so then work on forming new categories of identity that they feel better suit them as beings. And I think there's been, the key shift there is a move from the imposition of identities onto people to people being allowed to determine them for themselves, and shifting relationship with institutions. Institutions will collect data.
I get a little lunch for you.
Hello.
Great.
Yeah.
Asparagus crepe.
Oh, yeah, that's
Are we up for
+1.
a break for lunch? I think I am.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Do we do about that?
Yeah. Do we record ourselves eating? I'm not sure.
Salad. I was waiting for a
Make sure
salad.
you want that.
The baguette.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Enjoy our topical water.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's
Can you really separate clearly the two mechanisms? You said that difference pre-exists, but then how do you know it's there if you don't have at least language to kind of
well, this is also where I think
articulate it?
this is also where I think something
Or as
like-
soon as you articulate it, does it become...
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think language fixes as well. And I think the idea of difference that I have in my head and also this idea of opacity relates to that as well. It's something that is, a continuum in flux. It doesn't stay still. And something like identity. Frantz Fanon talks about identity or talks about identity as being death. Identities are dead because they're fixed and therefore they no longer allow for the inherent kind of flux, the continuums that we've been talking about, and a lot of categorization and identity production does that. It fixes something in a mold, which then essentially kills it, kills its life. And I think, so that's how I kind of conceptualize it. That actually we're talking about this kind of, it's quite difficult to give it a kind of visual metaphor, which is what I kind of want to do, but this sort of active substrate that is then collected and produced into things, entities that have an identity. So rather than starting with this idea that things have a kind of essential identity, which then generates a difference amongst things, difference is what generates identity through the process of subject formation. And I think that's a really important philosophical, conceptual point, that because it makes us think about things in a slightly different way.
And they form a dialectical relationship, but what are their start points? Sorry, yeah.
No, not at all. No, I finished. I think it's important because it stops us thinking about, the kind of idea of an essential subject or being a subject, and make us think about processes of subjectivation. So how are we produced as subjects? And that's when you link things to the stories around politics and culture, when you can't disconnect it from all of those stories that it's inherently related to. It's very easy to portion things off into kind of autonomous categories if we think as identity as starting things, because we think about things as self-identical, contained units, rather than fundamentally in assemblages and connected, interrelated in a kind of socio-material way, that then these categories by language, by politics, by culture, by discourse are produced by power. I think that's definitely
But
kind of
also
how I
without categories you cannot speak. You
Yeah.
cannot live. So
So there's a tension,
you need them. Yeah, otherwise you remain in the substract.
Yeah, absolutely.
Indifferentiated substract.
Absolutely. Which is why there's a real tension at the heart of it, but I think recognizing it and being able to speak about it allows us to think then about how to incorporate into the way that we deal with and we talk about things and we act and our kind of ethics, how might we live. You incorporate the process of production
Yeah, but
into that, which is important.
Yeah, but it doesn't belong only to the power.
No, no.
Look at the political fights or political struggles all around the world, or the minorities. They don't say we want to stay in indifferentiated substrat. They fight for recognition, which means for a category.
Yeah.
So it's just that which status you give to these categories. Are they fixed and permanent, or are they temporary and contextual?
I couldn't agree more. I think it's important, but I think there's a real tension at the heart of kind of like a politics that seeks for kind of recognition and assimilation and legislation by a certain power structure, but actually those categories are also what gets used to oppress at the same time. And it's a really big debate at the heart of queer politics, for example, about the idea of a kind of anti-essential approach that undoes identity categories, and one in a more kind of traditional LGBT politics, perhaps, that seeks that kind of recognition in the state. And it is a tension because actually you kind of need both. And I think, there's definitely a tension at the heart of it for sure. But yeah.
It's making me think about the whole debate on the écriture inclusive in France as well. I don't know if you've heard about the inclusive writing.
Oh, yes,
it's
yes.
called. So this. Well, some people trying to come up with, they're not rules. It's more like a way of spelling. So it only applies to writing, and make the two genders in French, because in French there are two genders, the masculine and the feminine. There is a neutral as such, like in German, for instance, but to make them visible on paper when you're writing. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, I'd really like an example.
Well, it's more like in English when you want to use a pronoun for a profession. For instance, we were talking about the interpreter, and when you want to reuse without repeating, you would say in English he, and if you don't know the gender, but you could say also she, or you could say they. So that's more or less the issue of the inclusive. Do you make the gender visible or not?
I think it's slightly different here because you make both genders visible. Like everybody went to the cinema, toutes les personnes sont allées, and then you need an agreement at the end here, and so you added a little dot, and then an e, which normally indicates the feminine form, and then another dot, and then the s, which indicates that it's plural. So you kind of make the feminine gender stand out more. You give it more visibility.
Yeah.
So is this because like when in kind of collective, so if there's 100 people in a room and 99 are female and one is male, in French the plural is always masculinized, right? So it's about not undoing that, basically, that it privileges the masculine in the plural. That's okay. Okay. So there's a way of actually in writing of trying to show that this is, a cross gender rather than masculinized. Okay, cool.
But is it really cross-gender, or is it masculine and feminine?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, then you've got the question of kind of, binarization as well.
Because the whole process kind of pits the one against the other, in a way. You're using it's called inclusive because, well, you're including both because that's what you've got, that's the resources that you've got, that the language provides. But at the same time, it kind of, in doing so, because also of the kind of discussions that it's generating at the moment, the Académie Française, a group of old people that said that they completely reject this kind of writing, that it's going to be the death of the French language or something like that.
We've been speaking about that for the last 500 years. Yeah. But it's strange, isn't it? Because when you talk about like inclusiveness, by its very kind of nature, you're sort of generating an exclusion at the same time, which is why actually the pronoun they in English is actually really useful, because it actually doesn't, it accommodates everything, right? And which I think is, when you've got a binarized gender structure in French, it's, yeah, like you say, the tools at hand make it very difficult to do, unless you create an entirely new category and structure or whatever. That's actually quite difficult, isn't it? I don't think I've ever been recorded eating my lunch before.
Well, I'm closest to the microphone and also eating the loudest food. So. Back in a minute.
Ultimately, it's whether people use it or not that will decide whether inclusive writing gets picked up. You know, the Académie Française can say whatever they want.
No, but the Académie Française doesn't prescribe anything. They just record the use. They don't produce norms.
But they
Ratify.
of course, they don't produce norm because, in a way, you know, no one can. We sort of have a norm imposed on us, but the norm is imposed by speakers, people, users of the language. But at the same time, they've got quite an powerful voice, and they're quite far-reaching. Well, in some circles, I suppose.
Like who? Which circles?
Conservative circles.
It's very general.
Conservative. Well, yes, but when you look at the kind of debate happening at the moment, there is really a debate. You know, there is a circle. There are whole groups of the population who completely sort of reject this idea, and bring up argument about the purity of the language. All the old argument that you bring up every time someone is trying to change something about the French language. It's sacred. You can't touch it, you can't do that to the language. And what does it mean for teaching? And then we're going to have to change all the keyboards to add an extra key. So I don't know whether they influence the conservatives or whether they're saying the same thing the conservatives do, but there is certainly some, not supporting each other, let's say. If you want to be really silly about it, you could say that the feminine form is always at the end of the words, so it always comes second. So the masculine always comes first, and you can start the whole debate all over again.
And what about the professions which are in a feminine form but occupied by male?
Le sage-femme.
Une éminence. So should you turn it masculine? Un éminent?
Un éminent.
How do you deal with that?
how do they do it in Canada? They always do it differently. They always handle these kind of things completely differently from the French.
Yeah, I don't know. You're right, we should have a look to them.
There is something I really like the sense that you can try and impose these norms and change these things, but like you say, whether it gets adopted or not, and language is that kind of ever evolving thing that's pretty amazing. And I remember the conversation a few years ago. I don't know a great deal about it, but I remember hearing it like the whole the French language is about to die because of all of these imports of English words into it, and of course it hasn't. And I went back to Paris recently, and it was actually amazing to hear how many kind of anglicised words are in slang as well, like shooter and things like this, and it's like an evolution of language that I've seen in my lifetime, which is quite fascinating. I also got really fascinated with like Verlan when I was living in Paris as well. This kind of like resistant language.
That was a big moment of Verlan when you were there.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? Like the end of the 90s, early 2000s with hip hop culture and it was quite amazing to like les keufs and we're mec, and I was like, God, I'm in Paris, I'm trying to learn French, but I'm also having to learn this entirely other language as well, because of certain friends of mine that I knocked about with. I just like, that doesn't even sound like French. What's going on? I'm having to learn two languages, and I really like that kind of like that sort of that kind of continuous hybridity of spoken language, and eventually it ends up in the written, in textual forms as well, written forms, and so I think that's one of the reasons why I really, really enjoy language as a thing, because it's very much a kind of
it's a living organism.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had a law that was passed in the early 90s, named after the Minister of Culture at the time, the Loi Toubon.
Okay.
To try and impose the use of French language, at certain French songs at certain times on the radio or in the advertising as well. And they had to change it a few times because it just wasn't working. And I remember a McDonald's ad, which was about a burger, like buy a burger, get one free or something like that. And so of course you can't use the word burger. So you could use it, but if you did, then you had to translate it at the bottom, and the translation was sandwich. And that was okay.
Steak haché.
But sandwich had been in the French language long enough, and it was all right. We know this one; it's okay.
It's like
but
when
burger is pushing it really, and it's really American. So
and it's
don't
like
want to go that
when Bush Jr. Criticizing France was saying about the economy because we're a socialist country. He was saying, the problem in France, they don't have a word like entrepreneur.
One of my favourite Bushisms. That it's just magnificent.
Brilliant, isn't it?
And the interesting evolution with regards to the inclusive writing is that before the internet, there weren't really any public spaces where French was written to communicate in a kind of day-to-day environment. Now on the internet, with social media in particular, you use written French all the time. So this is why it might actually, this is something that might actually, it might take hold. Whereas 20 years ago, it certainly almost couldn't have unless it was supported by institutions.
And particularly, the kind of the institutions, particularly the knowledge production in France, are so well, maybe not so much anymore, but definitely kind of so connected with the state as well, that everything is so quite centralised, and there is like a real sense of a sort of centralised control, isn't it? Still, that's true actually. I mean, one thing I've noticed with French friends of mine on Facebook and social media is that I like abbreviations and shortening and slang, and I just can't. It takes me a while to actually read like stuff, chatty French that I should be able to like not have forgotten them. I'm like, this is all part. I don't. How do they abbreviate? Because they work in different ways in different languages, don't they? There's kind of abbreviations. So it's
But that's not what you're taught in language courses, presumably. So
no, definitely not.
get taught a more kind of, I don't know, classical French or German.
Yeah. And when I was
Slang
in
is
France,
something that you only pick up when you're really immersed in a language and a culture.
for sure. And when I was there, it was kind of like early internet days as well. So I mean, I think I sent my first email from a cafe in Paris.
Oh, really? That's very chic.
But yeah, like, so, you know, Facebook and the like really wasn't something that existed back then.
You mentioned Verlan, and Verlan is was and originally completely spoken, exclusively spoken, and now it's finding its way into subtitles. I mentioned Verlan in my book on the subtitling of African American English because a few different people, different translators, have used Verlan to translate African American English.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which means that there has to have been a process of codification as well, because these words
Yeah.
are not written.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Do people want coffee? Should I see? Is there still coffee there? Or
I wouldn't mind a cup of tea.
maybe there's some hot water? I'll go and check on that. State of drinks.
Look at us all with our mobile phones.
Yeah, well, the budget is happening at the moment, and normally it's something that I wouldn't be that interested in, but there's this genuine question with the budget now on like how far the government are going to row back on kind of austerity policies. So it's more interesting than usual.
In the context of Brexit, presumably, or
Well, not even that really. More in the context of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party just sort of changing the nature of political discourse, and finally producing a substantive opposition to this sort of economic policy that the government, having spent sort of a year and a half, 2 years, just kind of laughing at us, and like, oh right, we have to take this quite seriously now. And Brexit as well, obviously, but yeah, more just sort of threat to the whole sort of neoliberal order, which I think is very, very interesting. It's kind of interesting sort of seeing that basically.
What type of tea would you like?
Just English breakfast, please. Yeah, it feels like they've completely painted themselves into a corner because they can't really substantially move away from austerity without admitting that they've made mistakes, and that the sort of 7 years of just like abject misery that they've like inflicted on the British people just weren't really necessary.
do you think they're going to back down?
Well, they can't really an awful lot. I mean, it's kind of almost comical, sort of looking at how narrow the limits are of what they can do. I mean, for example, in response to the disaster that has been rail privatisation and the sort of lawlessness and of the pricing and just the baffling nature of, like, it's just really hard to book a railway ticket in this country. It's really, really difficult to, book one that's sort of reasonably priced. And, most people just rather be able to buy one ticket that you can use on any train, for example. And, in response to this, like, obviously, the Corbyn Labour Party has promised just, like, complete renationalisation. And the Tories have come up with, like, a millennial rail card, which lets you get a third off fares until you're 30,
I'm with you, thank you.
But the point is that even with a third off the fares, they're not affordable. That's the issue.
It seems to be so completely random. I've never really.
I mean, someone was just saying on Twitter, like, as an annual season ticket from Horsham to London Victoria, which really isn't very far, is like £3,200 a year. In Germany, for £4,000 a year, you can buy a season ticket for the entire national rail network, which is just unbelievable. It really is scandalous. So yeah, just kind of looking at some of the stuff around that, really, and I kind of like following this stuff on Twitter because it's also very, very funny. But it's an interesting issue with regards to what we're saying at the start of this conversation about opacity is that, and political organisation, is the way that Twitter in particular has made all of these arguments very, very out in the open. I mean, obviously not everyone is using Twitter, and but sort of pretty much everyone in sort of media or political sort of circles is.
And then it's whatever trends.
Yeah, but I mean, arguments are all done in public, and there tends to be a lot of kind of denunciation and disowning and things. And I think the internet and social media is very, very good for getting communities together, and not particularly good for keeping them together. That's my kind of broad feeling on them. That's generally been how I've seen this stuff play out. A lot of these arguments just, in the olden days, on the kind of radical left, you'd have a beef with somebody, you'd sit on it for a year, you'd have it out at the anarchist book fair, and then you'd go for a pint after, whereas now it's kind of like, oh, I hate you so much, you said
Have a
this
Twitter feud, yeah.
3 years ago, and you're awful, and I loathe you, and I can't be in the same room as you, and all of this. It's just terrible. But yeah, the government are sort of making some fairly weak pronouncements on the housing crisis, and Philip Hammond is saying he's going to try and halve rough sleeping by 2022, but it doubled since 2010, so all he'll be doing is getting it back to where it was when he came in.
The opacity surrounding Brexit is interesting as well. The fact that the British government won't release their reports.
Yeah.
The EU have.
Yeah, absolutely.
They make for a very interesting reading.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of pressure on them to release their reports, and they just won't do it.
No, because it would compromise the position for Brexit.
Yeah.
It sort of invites you to think that.
And
that's
I think,
very good.
and I think in this case, it's not so much because there's like information that they really need to protect for sensitive reasons. It's because there's nothing there, and they just don't know what they're doing. I mean, the issue around that after the referendum, kind of last summer, when when the vote went leave, and people said, okay, what's going to happen to the Northern Irish border then? And the response of the Leave team was, oh shit, we forgot about that.
Yeah.
And I suspect that yeah, this would be quite similar.
The EU report on the Northern Ireland situation is interesting, and they explain that the Northern Ireland government doesn't actually have any power and will actually have to wait until after Brexit to have any kind of.
And of course, the Northern Irish government isn't in a state to do anything at the moment anyway.
Well, yeah.
Power sharing has kind of collapsed, and yeah, it's staggering kind of crisis of legitimacy, really.
That it's kind of an issue for London, really, to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely, which it shows little sign of doing.
It doesn't really look like it's making any progress as well. All these talks that they're having, you hear one
It's going
thing.
nowhere, yeah.
Well, that's what Barnier says. David Davis is always more
I mean, the tactic
positive, but
here, I
it's
think,
difficult to take him seriously.
is probably just to bore the public into no longer caring about it. I can't see any other methodology at work.
What's interesting in the EU reports as well is that they take for granted that the UK leaving the EU is not economically motivated.
Yeah,
That it's purely ideological.
yeah, yeah.
It will take the
Largely just
economy-
racist.
yeah, largely. But they seem to have completely accepted the idea that using any economy-based arguments in this debate on Brexit was just
Not going to wash.
it was going to fall in a deaf ear.
Well, I mean, it's partly because both Tories and Labour for the last sort of 15 years, politics is purely about the economy and it's not about culture and it's not really...
That seems to be the way in most of Western Europe. I think.
But yeah, that's kind of neoliberalism for you, isn't it? There's a very good
yeah.
article by James Meek in the London Review of Books, possibly last year or maybe early this year, but it opened up with exactly that point about this separation of economics and culture, and how it's fed into the Brexit vote. And he was talking specifically about the example he used was, I think it's called Summerdale, which was the Cadbury's chocolate plant in the West Country, I think, sort of between Bath and Bristol. And, it was set up by these, Victorian Quakers, basically. And, the idea behind it was, not just that you would have a job, but there's kind of a whole way of life attached to it. There's, places for, subsidised housing for the workers to live in around it. There's, for gyms, swimming pool, and sports facilities and a sports team attached to it, and all these things, and, sort of sense of community around it, and this idea that these jobs would have been handed down from generation to generation to generation. And then, I think Kraft bought Cadbury and then just moved the plant wholesale to Poland. And, so maybe the people who worked at the plants could find other jobs, sure, but they wouldn't find kind of long-term jobs that would have all these benefits with them and this whole way of life associated with them. And nearly everybody who'd worked at this plant and lost their job voted leave, and I don't blame them. It's well worth looking up. It's a really interesting piece. I mean, it's quite long, but James Meek is such a good writer. It's really worth a look. It's quite eye-opening. Yeah. And he also wrote a really good book. Well, it's just a compilation of other London Review of Books articles called Private Island, and it's just all about just various catastrophes of privatisation, and all of them are staggering. And he ends the book with an article about going to Thanet, which was the seat that Nigel Farage stood in and nearly won but didn't quite. And just, the upshot of everything being privatised and all kind of industry and facilities and services being taken out of the hands of the people, and then why that kind of take back control idea resonated with people as a kind of slogan. It's really interesting. The chapter on the water privatisation is absolutely staggering, and he sort of talks about these floods in the southwest 10 years ago in Tewkesbury and Gloucester.
Yeah, I remember those.
Which were really serious, huge, which were just largely a result of deregulating and privatising the water industry, and definitely worth reading. I mean, it wasn't like a natural disaster at all. very
Wow.
much a result of like cost cutting and just poor practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very good.
I remember reading a story a while back. My mum was a primary school teacher for a long time, and public, private finance initiatives when they were pushed through by the
Such
Labour
a
government,
catastrophe, yeah.
and it ended up, companies subcontracted to other companies and written into the contracts that, for example, in one school, in order to change a light bulb, you weren't able just to go to the corner shop and buy a light bulb and put it in, because that would be breach of contract. You had to call out the maintenance subcontractor to come and do it for you, which cost £300.
And this is the sort of thing that if it happened in like Ceausescu's Romania, we'd never hear the end of it. But like, as it's in Britain, it's like, good old free enterprise. The market, what can you do,
Yeah.
How do we feel about carrying on this conversation? We've been going for like 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
It's good enough.
I don't know. I feel like I'm in this position, with the brackets chair. It's my name. That I'm like the one
You've got
that's
a title, yeah.
ventriloquising the institution or
I
something.
feel like I'm running
know
out
what
of
I'm
things
doing.
to say. But,
But I know no more than you. As the kind of the quick conversation I had, and bear in mind I have had no communication with Lara at all, was that the time frame is completely and utterly open-ended. We could speak for as long or as much or as little as we felt fit to do or interested in. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about some of these words?
We could do, couldn't we? I don't know. Does anyone have burning desire to? Speak about something.
My train is at 5.
So you've got loads of time. I'm happy.
good,
I'm happy to continue for sure. I suppose this is my kind of job, to try and push this in a certain.
Was that your job?
Apparently so. Yeah. As chair.
as chair, yeah, that would be what you
It's
do.
the kind of that's it. Yeah. I suppose, yeah, maybe was there a specific word that you'd picked out that you were interested in talking about?
So I was always trying to relate them to my field, because it's what I'm most comfortable with. And sometimes it was relatively straightforward, and sometimes it was a little bit more difficult. We talked a little bit about translation earlier, and as a translator, you're a little bit in the dark, and so the translation process, I suppose, is a little bit opaque. First, we don't really know what happens in the translation process. We know we have an original, we know we have a translation, but everything that happens in the middle is kind of a little bit, it happens, but what exactly happens is very difficult to theorize. It's difficult to actually crystallize it in words. And when you're a translator, you're also very often not working with the author right there. Sometimes you do, and when you do that, you often consider yourself fortunate to be able to go to the author and ask questions. And you're working without a reader as well, so you have a kind of intended reader. You have a set of assumptions, depending on how the book is going to be marketed, who the publisher is, and these sorts of things. So you're working with a lot of absentees, I suppose. And I read a book not very long ago. It was published in 2009 by a French author. I think it's been translated in Italian, which is interesting, but I don't think it's been translated in English. And the title is, in English it's translated as Translator's Revenge.
Okay. Who's the author?
Brice Mathieuson.
Okay.
He's a translator himself, and
Right.
that's his first novel.
Okay.
So he's translated a lot of American authors in particular. And if you look at the back cover of the book, it says that the book is a translation. And it's not, because the original doesn't exist. And then you open the book and you start reading the book, and the translation of the text isn't there. So all you get is just a blank page with a little star, and then a black line and the translator's note. And all you get is the translator's note. So it's trying to pass as a translation of an original. So the original doesn't exist, the translation doesn't exist, and then you get the translator's notes. And the first note, the translator, in fact, turns out the narrator, introduces himself and says, okay, so I live here, I live under this black line. This is my lair. I don't meddle with my upstairs neighbor. He's got the luxury apartment, and I live in my cave. And gradually you start accessing the thoughts of this translator, and he says, I really don't like the style of the author, so I've deleted all the adjectives. Here goes. This one, this one, this one, this one, that one. And I thought I'd delete this whole paragraph as well, because I don't like the way it reads, and then shows you, okay, I've deleted this paragraph. But it doesn't fit anywhere because you don't have anything else. But through the bits that were deleted, you start gaining access into the kind of story that is supposed to be going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure.
It's
What strikes me?
it's very
But
postmodern.
that's very true for, I would say, translation, which is slightly different for interpretation in real time.
Absolutely.
I've talked with a lot of interpreters at the ICC, at the criminal court, and they were telling me that, in fact, in order to do a good job, they have to not think about what they are translating. So they have no idea what they're talking about. They are in a sort of state of trance,
Yeah.
and they just, like a open, how would you say, robinet?
Yeah. Tap.
Tap, open tap. They translate in real time, but they have no idea. If you stop them and if you ask them, what are you talking about? They don't know. And they say, if we start to think about what we are translating, we are lost, because we will losing time, and then the speakers will be like 5 sentences away, and we won't be able to.
So they really are like a kind of ventriloquist sort of dummy. Like
Yeah.
they just.
And the same for the stereotypist.
It's not a mediation in terms of an intellectual mediation. It's a bodily mediation.
It's not analytic at all.
Yeah.
And it's the same for the stenotypist who write down
Yeah.
what do you call them, the court
Transcriptions.
Yeah.
court transcriptions.
Yeah.
They don't know what they are typing. They type, and they said, if we start to think about what we are listening, we get lost.
It's purely muscle memory almost.
Yeah.
It's almost like kind of, I don't know, playing tennis or something, isn't it? You've like kind of warmed up,
Yeah.
and then you get to that point where you're not thinking constantly about what you do, and
Yeah,
if you do,
like
then
piano
you'll
playing.
fall apart. Yeah.
You don't know where your fingers are going. So I guess it's different. Although it could seem very close, translating and interpreting, in fact, it seems to be very different in terms of mechanisms.
Absolutely. The with machine translation and translation apps, this seems to be bringing the two back together to an extent. If you're using a translation app, or if you're using Google Translate, or I don't know if you've seen, but Google have made this little earpiece that you can wear, which is like a Babelfish, like a universal translator device thing, which probably works in some context, with some language pairs, at least to an extent.
But it's kind of interesting,
With
isn't
others.
it? When you just get a web page translated or something through Google, and quite often I find myself reading Wikipedia in like foreign languages and just getting it translated, and wondering when the point will arrive where the automatic translation would be indistinguishable from a human translation because we're clearly not there yet. Yeah, you know, they're not good translations. You can kind of pass the information you want from them, so they're useful in that respect. But you know, they're not.
Could I still have a job?
Yes.
They're changing the models actually from into neural translation. Apparently, I couldn't tell you exactly
Right.
what that means.
No.
But they're in the process of changing the way that we do machine translation. Google or in particular.
Yeah. Because before they were using rules from grammar and they were trying to generate language from the rules. And now they are having a totally different approach. Google scan Google to see how people speak and what are the current uses. And by scanning the uses, which are, sorry for my English, in use, you get much better results than starting for the rules generating sentences. Because they were not able to get out of the grammar book. While now they are just scanning how people speak.
And using collocation, like association of words and their frequency.
Right.
Enjoy everything?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Anything else for you?
I'm all right.
No, I'm okay.
I will leave you the coffee and teas in that side, okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
You finished with that one?
Yes. I thought it was something else that I ordered.
What did you order?
A lentil and feta salad.
What was the problem with it? Like this?
Oh, I thought it was... No,
it was more.
I thought it was only lentil and...
Okay. Sorry about that. The manager should make sure.
You see, it was not visible in the menu, the ingredients.
But
It was not described enough.
it
It was written only lentil and feta.
it struck me when you were talking about the kind of translator's revenge book as well. This kind of the visibility, you know, the deliberate and conceptual visibility of the translator in this book, and the kind of play of form. This is supposed to be a translation. I'm going to come back to because I think it's something that I think is really continued worth of exploring. That this idea that by rendering something visible, in actual fact, you maybe increase the kind of sense of opacity, because what that actually points to is all of these networks of production that often go unnoticed. I mean, exactly that. The idea of it's similar. I mean, when you were talking about the invisibility of the translator, I was thinking about the invisibility of the photographer in something like photojournalism. And recently, a few years ago, maybe there was a case of someone being fired from Washington Post, I can't remember who it was, or a press network, for photoshopping out an image of a camera in a picture of conflict from Syria. And this was, you know, deemed obviously against ethical standards because the picture had been altered. But the reason why the image of the camera needed to be removed from the final image was because it actually reminds us that there's a mediation by photographer rather than this kind of transparent or sense of a transparent window on the world. And it struck me as the same thing, that once you render things visible, you actually increase the kind of signifiers of opacity. And I think that's I just think that's a really interesting dynamic, because often, as we kind of started this off right at the beginning, this idea of the association with opacity and kind of, you know, not seeing or lack of vision or something. I think there's something really, you know, important about that to a certain extent. And I wonder if there's maybe other examples we can perhaps think about. Yeah.
So, again, in the context of translation, the guy I was mentioning earlier, Venuti, says, you know, that you should, as much as possible, leave traces to make it clear that what you're writing is in fact a translation. And he gives kind of practical ways of doing this by leaving what he calls the remainder, by using things like archaic forms or underused words in your translation. So words that are going to call attention to themselves, and as a reader, you're like, well, this is unusual.
Okay, interesting.
Whereas the overwhelming majority would normally make sure that the translation reads in a kind of very seamless sort of way, that it is, really quite transparent, so that the story can draw you in. And Benuti takes the opposite side and says, well, actually, if you leave those little traces, and you create this kind of opacity, then the opacity can draw you in a completely different way. Where Venuti is perhaps a little less clear is, what do you do with the text that's not transparent to begin with? With the text that's really fuzzy, where meaning is really deliberately opaque.
Translating poetry is particularly interesting from
Absolutely.
that point of view. I mean, especially translating quite a lot of like French modernist writers who make quite a lot of play with homophones. Think of people like Guillaume Apollinaire or Romain Roussel, and anyone who translates that sort of work is going to have to really be quite open with the reader about what decisions that they've made, because you're not just translating content, you're translating form as well. And
Do you speak a little bit of French?
only GCSE French, so
Because if we all speak French, we would make it more opaque.
oui. Well, that's all I've got really.
But no, I think that what you just made me think of there as well is like there's a reason I was thinking also about the photography example. I was talking to some students and they mentioned the fact that actually sometimes what we desire is not to have to face that kind of level of opacity. There's something about that kind of that illusion of transparency that is desirable. And I think poetry perhaps, sometimes if you're reading poetry, to have a kind of framework of explanation next to it and for it to become really kind of given that kind of supporting cast, maybe there is something that's, I don't know, something about poetry, about losing myself in this kind of really quite opaque world already.
There was a big debate in the 80s in French poetry field about bilingual edition, bilingual publication.
Yeah.
A lot of poets were very much against bilingual publication because they were saying that when you translate a poem, you create a new text, you create a new poem.
Yeah.
And by having a bilingual edition, you keep the translation under the power of the original text instead of freeing him and allowing it to be to stand on its own feet.
Interesting.
And it raises questions about which languages you present in bilingual editions and which you don't.
True. Yeah.
Because if you're translating from a different alphabet, well, it's a completely different kind of game. I remember a translation of the Italian poet Giuseppe Ungaretti, and one of his most famous poems. I don't even know if it's got a title, but it's something like Millumino Dimenso. Obviously, Lara will most certainly know his work. And this was just translated in the bilingual edition as I am filled with light. And I remember the reviewer just saying, what's the point? Why translate that? But, obviously it was in like Arabic or Russian or something, or Greek, then there'd be far more of a necessity to do that. But I found that really interesting, this idea that, you could sell a translation of Italian poems to somebody who doesn't read Italian. There would be points where the translation is just not needed, either for meaning or aesthetic purposes. That feels to me like quite a kind of an exception rather than a rule.
It's a very it's often, let's say, a disenchanted world, the world of translation. So many of these decisions are down to the publisher, and what they and are down to marketing. It's so hard when you write translation to choose its cover when you're the translator. It happens very, very rarely that you are allowed to. And if you are allowed, it's often, after hours of negotiation with.
But not only for the
with
translator, for the author too.
Yeah.
The author
For the
never
author as
choose-
well, yeah, you're right.
He never
So you
choose,
kind
they
of-
never choose their cover. It's the space of the editor.
Yeah.
Front
The-
cover and
I've chosen the cover for both of my books, but they're both with quite small presses.
yeah,
so-
with small presses because you have a direct
yeah, yeah.
relationship with the publisher. But as soon as it's a big corporation,
Can I ask a question in terms of translation industry? Am I right in thinking that something like a more kind of fiction commercial text will tend to not list the translator's name, or if it is in the small print, it's never predominantly there within the kind of paratext and all that kind of stuff. But more in academic publishing, because it's perhaps important to know the context, etc. The translator is often there on the title page. Is that something? Is that true, or is that something I noticed? But I have no knowledge of whether that's actually the case. Or?
I have a PhD student who's working on translation reviews,
Okay.
and he's going through reviews of translated books in the UK, in France, and in Germany. He's finding all sorts of really interesting things. As far as fiction, let's go with fiction first, because it's probably it's perhaps the one that's the most interesting because of what we've witnessed over time as well. If I can go back to Venuti, and his idea that translators are invisible, he actually argues in his book in '95 that translators are very rarely given any credit. And he says it's a very Anglo-American thing to do, and he doesn't really give any figures. But actually what my PhD student is finding is that in translation reviews, translators tend to be acknowledged more often than they are in France or in Germany. I think we are moving more and more towards more acknowledgement of the translator. The names tend to be, it tends to be included, it tends to be there, at least in some way. If it's not on the cover, then maybe on the back cover. If not on the back cover, then on the first page inside the book. I don't think it's quite systematic yet, but we're going towards that. There was a big campaign called Name the Translator.
Yes. They got in touch with me. I reviewed a book in translation, and they were like, "This is great, but name the translator."
Well, there you go.
So yeah, now I try to do so if I write about fiction in translation, which I do quite a lot.
And it's interesting because it gives some visibility. The name of the translator is there, but in reviews in particular, very often that's all you get, and you get no analysis of the actual translation itself as a translation. There's no comment on the act of translation and how the translation, whether it's even good or bad.
but you have
in
a
really simple terms.
biography of the translator in the review.
No, not ever.
But it
I don't think.
can be, if you're reviewing a book and you're not fluent in the original language or you haven't read it, then it's generally, I think, quite hard to say if something's a good or bad translation. I mean, I feel it more with poetry. I was reading some Romanian, surrealist poetry in translation recently. And, even though I was not familiar with the work in the original language and, we didn't do Romanian at school, I could tell these were like bad translations because this poet had quite a sort of high reputation for being really interesting, and then what I had on the page in English just felt quite kind of like lumpen and dull. And then I sort of read through the introduction to this text of this poet. It's called Shelu Nam. Read the introduction to the Shelu Nam in English kind of anthology, and sure enough, the editor says, "Look, we've got these older translations of Naum's works from the 30s, and the translator himself said he was fairly dissatisfied with them." But it was only really when I sat down with a Romanian friend who was also a fan of this poet, and we looked at the works together, and she kind of said, well, no, you could translate this like this, and yeah, this is a bad translation for this reason. But there's no way I'd have been able to go much beyond that, just sort of vague instinct without a native speaker.
You're right. Sometimes it's just very difficult, particularly with more minor languages, to find a reviewer who's fluent in the original language and in English. It's also very interesting because it begs the question of the status of translation as text and whether they exist independently of the original at all, and on what grounds they should be assessed. Whether they should be assessed for their intrinsic qualities, or whether they should be assessed in the context of their relationship with the original.
I'm into an
And I don't have an answer to that.
extra layer to the text I translated, where the name of the translator group got in touch with me. It was Tristano by an Italian author, Nanni Balestrini. It was published in the 60s. He was very into early computing, and basically the book was sort of one of the first examples of using algorithms in creative work. And he wrote, I think there's 15 chapters which have 15 or 16 sets of 2 paragraphs per page, and he made an algorithm where within each chapter the sets of paragraphs could appear in any order. So there's 150 trillion different variations of this book that are theoretically possible. I think Verso published a run of 4,000 of them in translation. So you've got a translation of an original text that is quite deliberately different every time it's published. So yeah, I just found the sort of multi-layeredness of that interesting.
It comes back to sort of section of my research as well around the kind of notion of the author function. Because obviously the notion of anonymity enters into, anonymous enters into the English language through literature. And pre 1800, everything was pretty much published anonymously. It was,
and authored sort of collectively a lot of the time.
But this is the thing I was thinking about then, about the idea of that kind of visibility of the translator. We also have this kind of, how do we think about the translator function? Because I've done one translation, and it wasn't not done on my own. I was the one that got the credit for it, but it was done in conversation with a friend of mine, Tom. I was translating a conference paper that was about Lacanian psychoanalysis. I have a little bit of knowledge about Lacan, but I'm not a Lacanian or an expert on Lacan, so all this technical language, so I had to consult somebody about that. I had a back and forth with the author, with the editor. It was a collective endeavour, and often, one of the criticisms that you get, and this is something that obviously in art history, the idea of the artist subject as this kind of unique transcendental genius ego has just been totally destroyed. So I suppose,
Were you acknowledged?
I don't know. I've never seen a final copy.
What was the text?
I don't actually
What were you
know.
translating?
It was on perversion and sublimation. It's quite interesting.
That sounds like sort of thing Lacan would have
But
written.
I suppose, we're talking about thinking about the introduction of a kind of the idea of the translator into the translated text. There's still kind of problems about how that kind of singularizes a kind of a translation, as well, which is not inherently
parallel problems to singular author.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Singular
so,
artist.
yeah.
For a show, when you know that the register is doing half of the job by providing the material, building the device.
Absolutely. It's exactly what we were talking about earlier about the people that aren't here that have produced this set of conditions for us to be here.
In order to allow us to have a floating conversation for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours.
Yeah.
It seems like we are by ourselves, but there are 10 people behind, in fact.
Absolutely. So I mean, yeah. So I don't know. I think in thinking about the kind of, Foucault talked about the idea of, he thought that everything for a year should be published anonymously. So, and then see if you could actually attribute anything to anybody, and that was his kind of dream, that this name was served very specific functions, which is categorization, commercialization, and actually someone like Forster said that literature tended towards the anonymous, and actually maybe there's more a case for kind of not naming and these things, but actually just maybe this is just text that is produced under a kind of a condition of anonymity, and we can acknowledge that it's a translation rather than the translator. That I don't know.
Yeah.
Just kind of
Well, at the same time, the name is a data among others.
Yeah.
If I go back to this example of the 6 monochromes by 6 different painters, if you don't know the name of who did this monochrome, then you're stuck. Because the name carries a lot of information, not about the geographical origin, but about the way of working. If you know a little bit about the work of the artist or about the writer, so you can already see in a different way the object. So I don't know if erasing the name would be a solution instead of adding more and more. I would go more on growing, having a bigger population instead of...
Which is the case for academic papers in the sciences, where you often have like 7 or 8 authors.
Exactly.
I'm thinking about a book that was written 10 or so years ago called Rena Spallings by Bernadette Corporation.
Oh yeah,
So this was an exercise in kind of anonymous, a collection of anonymous writers, so 150 different writers that came together to write this book under the name Bernadette Corporation, which is also a fiction and a kind of anonymous, in inverted commas, group. And I found this book quite fascinating. Insofar as it's sort of, especially thinking about this, how do you go about, like the first 3 pages of the book become about who these people were, but then also who did they speak to, and I think there's something about excess that I think is.
There's an interesting.
I think there's something about excess here that I'm trying to get at.
But it's not exactly anonymity because they're signed under the fictional name of Bernadette.
Yeah, it's a pseudonym.
Corporation.
Yeah.
So the reader can rely on this branding, let's say.
Yeah.
It's not like anonymous writing.
No.
Well, another interesting example to throw in here, there was a novel published in the early 70s called London Consequences, and Consequences, that kind of game where it's quite popular with the surrealists, so I think called it Exquisite Corpse, where each author doesn't know what the preceding author has written and kind of writes something that adds to the story, and you kind of see what you've got at the end of it. And with London Consequences, it was published that the book was sort of edited and collated by Margaret Drabble and B.S. Johnson. And then there was a list of 20 authors who'd written a chapter of the book, but you weren't told which author had written each chapter. And it was actually a competition. And if you wrote in and correctly identified all of the authors, you won like a fairly substantial amount of money, I think. And I don't know if anyone won. But this is obviously playing on the fact that these authors had a recognisable style. Like most of the authors were kind of neo-modernist writers who had this very sort of auteur approach to their kind of text, and the idea was they'd have a sort of recognisable style. And I wrote a monograph on one of the authors who contributed to this book, and I had a fairly good idea of which chapter was his, but I never found out. And I don't know actually if the results of this are online anywhere, but I think that's quite interesting as well, this idea of being kind of anonymous and not anonymous at the same time.
So you were saying that if you succeed to recognize, you win a fair amount of money.
Yeah.
And if you fail, do you get electrocuted?
No, the stakes for failing were fairly low.
So there is no, let's say, tension about failing?
No. I think if a publisher kind of killed people for reading their books incorrectly, then I don't know. No way of knowing without a controlled experiment. But I'm going to look that up actually. I'm going to see if I can find any indication of.
I find it interesting thinking about this idea of attribution as well, because there's a whole discipline, academic discipline called attribution studies, which looks at attributing texts to authors that were previously anonymous or pseudonymous, or and it's kind of treated as this sort of. So that I think there's a guy called Harold Love, I think his name is, that wrote in the introduction that, you know, this is, we still need the author despite the kind of proclamations of Barthes and people like that, the death of the author, all this sort of stuff. But what's interesting about what I read recently, there's somebody called Donald Foster, I think, who's an American attributor that used kind of algorithmic software and again, matches of stylistic keys and things like this to attribute a text of Shakespeare's or something like that. You know, there's this ongoing discussion about whether Shakespeare wrote the sonnets and whatnot. But what interested me about this story was the fact that he also works for the cops. So he's also he's an academic that attributes literary tracts, who also deals with ransom notes and traces criminals. And I found
it's
this kind
forensic linguistics.
I found this kind of like this connection, this kind of like literary attribution and the police and the state. This just quite a fascinating thing to try and think through and think about. Like, there's this desire to uncover, to render transparent. It's very state-oriented.
It's a legal discipline called forensic linguistics, where they're exactly what you're saying. They're supposed to being able to attribute an anonymous letter to an author. Or audio recording.
I mean, there's loads of arguments happening now at the moment in terms of kind of whether the idea of anonymity is but a dream, actually, because they say that 80% of the population can be identified by postcode, by 3 pieces of information basically, and if you add a mobile phone in, it becomes almost the whole population by location data. By kind of, and you have no idea, you don't need a name, you don't need any of those really like clear signifying, just behavioural patterns and stuff like this. It's this idea of kind of, this sort of, this total rendering transparent of society is very much kind of being, I don't know, it is written into technology, but I don't know. I think that's why I think there's something about this category of opacity that's actually really quite important to think about politically as well, insofar as and I like this idea we thought about as a kind of granular sense. It is something about trying to intervene or interject into this sort of, the trying to rendering smooth of society, so it's open for, well, largely for economic flows to go wherever they want. And I don't know, I think the political question of opacity is an important one. And I don't know, that kind of attributing authorship and this connection to the state through forensic writing seem to make that kind of very, that kind of thing quite clear. But also it's something I think that we as human beings have also kind of internalized, and we want to know as well. We desire to know things. We desire to uncover, to be like kind of, and I don't know how you kind of go about resisting that kind of, that we, as soon as you hear something, and I don't know, for me, sort of the instinct is to kind of, particularly in academia and institution as well, like the whole thing is about kind of rendering the object of your study entirely open and transparent for critical, critical intervention or people to see. So how do we kind of go about what may be the practices of sort of clamouring for this right to opacity that Glissant talked about? I mean, that seems to me that it starts really with a kind of acknowledgement that we've internalized this process of knowing, of wanting to know and wanting to render everything understandable, which may be impossible, but it's a behaviour that I think we all, to a certain extent, do. Or I don't know, just. Yeah. Yeah, I think Glissant in an interview spoke about, so I'm thinking about documentary practice as well. So documentary practice is one of those practices which is, supposedly it's the idea of rendering things clear and transparent. And Glissant spoke to a young artist who was planning to make a documentary about him or about his experiences at this conference. And already he was asking the filmmaker to kind of try and forget about his instincts, to sort of like do the kind of, I want to know, and suggested that just a long shot of the surface of the sea would suffice for this documentary. Like, and you know, I don't know what type of ways. Do we use opacity or try and search or claim opacity as in art practice or in political practice? I don't know. It's just an open thought, an open question, really.
What are the pressures, do you think? What is it that makes us behave the way we do? And want to try and attribute authorship.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Maybe is it some sort of kind of are we sort of still? I don't know. Because I don't know. I see what you're saying about the monochromes as well. Like how 5 different monochromes with connected to 5 different practices is actually important because it allows us to think about them in different ways. But as long as we don't sort of think about the 5 people that made them, whose names attached to them, as this kind of like sort of autonomous kind of subjects, like, you know, the kind of hero artist, because of course it's not like that. So yeah, they're definitely data, as you say, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I think
But
maybe
it's not only because the names encapsulate something more. It's just a sticker, just a label for something else. But in fact, you should add much more data. For instance, how much time did it take?
Yeah.
Because a monochrome could have taken 2 minutes with a roll brush,
6 years.
or 6 years with a tiny paintbrush. It could have involved 20 people, or 1 person, or it could have been how do you call externalized in China. Can have been made in China or in India. So you need to add more and more instead of, in fact, deleting. It's but that's true that, for instance, when you say Jeff Koons, you know that it's not one person; it's a corporation behind. So you have a lot of data just by that. It's not enough, of course, because you don't have. I mean, it plays too much on a myth or on a rumor.
I do wonder though if how in kind of, if you were to mention someone like Damien Hirst, somebody that is who is Damien Hirst Incorporated, for sure is a corporation, right? Like if you were to mention that to somebody who wasn't necessarily familiar with the art world or familiar with art, would that still resonate as this kind of individualized persona? And I think it probably does for the majority of people. So how do you go about, I don't know, introducing a kind of opacity into someone like Hirst? That's an interesting
We're back
question.
in the open source jihad.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
How do you learn the vocabularies? Which means, how do you get, let's say, immersed, or how do you become part of a group? So it doesn't need to be specifically jihadi group. It can be art group. How do you get accustomed to Damien Hirst practice?
I mean, there's interesting. I'm thinking about the artist collective Clairefontaine.
Yes.
And this neon sign was made by. So it's a selection of neon signs that have the name of the person who was the principal producer and then how much they cost. And so it's a kind of like, you know, play on kind of conceptualism's love of the neon sign, but it's also doing exactly this. It's opening up, and Clairefontaine is a pseudonym that's been taken from the French stationery company called a ready-made artist. So it's kind of play on Duchamp's ready-made. And so there's something happening in that practice that's pointing at exactly those things, that this is a ready-made artist. There's nobody in particular behind this. They even say that the management is an empty centre. And incorporated into the work is very much the artisan and the economic remuneration that happened is in there. So it is this kind of like, it's pointing to exactly that, isn't it? It's sort of, you go into a gallery perhaps to be, sometimes, I don't know, people go into a gallery to kind of have that illusion, a space away from the world, whatever, and you're being confronted by its complicity in it, but also you can't even point to this kind of like hallowed person behind it because that space is empty, which says a lot about kind of art production, general cultural production, I think. I think there's something important in that, and yeah, there's a kind of opacity to that practice, I think, that's ironically, but you know, from what we've been talking about, in bright neon and rendering something reasonably transparent, does the kind of, it's this tension, isn't it? It's interesting. Yeah. So yeah, how do we transplant open source jihad onto cultural production then?
Well, it's transparent.
I think I'd like to see Damien Hirst work with them on a project. I'd pay to see that.
And also the other question, so you say we want more. There's something about, but we also spoke at the beginning a little bit about the idea that if you've got that kind of total visibility, then things become kind of nonsensical in a way. So is there a kind of, where do we stop? Exactly, yeah.
Well, there is no answer.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's a situation which determines, it's a group which considers that's enough. We are more or less all in now. It's a group. And I think it's related to the action. For instance, should we invite the guards to be part of it? Do they play a role or not in this event? Well, maybe not all the guards, but the ones who are present today, or the one who take care of this part of the building. I don't know.
Who cleaned the floor this morning? The people that brought dinner.
Well, there were
Who sanded
people.
this down?
There were
The
people
catering.
talking behind the curtain
Absolutely,
earlier,
yeah.
and I found myself thinking, should I go and say to them, "Look, we're recording. Can you keep it down?" Or should I kind of stop talking so that they can be picked up properly by the microphone? And I'm alright, actually.
Yes. The people of the catering
Yeah,
allowed us
absolutely.
to keep working
Yeah,
without
absolutely.
rest.
And, you know, and it's also interesting that they appear by a trace on the recording, and yet, you know, many other people that were perhaps involved in the production of this are absentees. And
So there is no pre-existing answer. I mean, where to stop? It's probably one of the relevant questions that should be asked in this kind of project. It's the same question for any investigation. Where should you stop to investigate? When and where?
Yeah, and why?
When is it enough?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Well, I found the MH370 stuff incredibly interesting, and sort of every 6 months or so you'll see a news report saying that they're going to start looking for this plane again, but
I thought that's what you're talking about. I was about to ask, but
public bodies will say, look, we just don't have the time or the money or the resources to keep looking. And I think the latest development is that like some private company has offered to look for the plane on a sort of no-win, no-fee basis.
Right.
And I'm really intrigued to see whether that finds anything or not. But yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just been the crucial problem for the investigation. It's like, well, this plane is probably in the ocean somewhere. Where'd you start? Because they don't have a good track on where it went. So that's been one of the more kind of fascinating stories of recent times for me. Really, just firstly, how do you lose an aircraft, and secondly, how do you find it?
Well, they just lost a submarine.
Yeah,
Did
that's
they?
right. Yeah.
In Argentina.
Really?
Yeah, and there's all these false
One
alarms
of the three
about.
biggest submarines, Argentina. They lost it
Just lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
last week.
Wow, I didn't see that.
It's
I
embarrassing.
didn't either.
Yeah, those things are
Yeah.
pretty big, right?
Yeah.
The set of keys, is it?
Wow.
going for 3 hours, I think.
It's not bad.
Yeah, it is. It's 5 to 3.
She will have to listen to. If we want to be very nasty, we would ask Angelica and Tham to listen to it too.
Yeah. All the people that made it possible.
Yeah.
There should
Including the person that drove the tram on the way
Yeah.
for me to come here
Mm.
today.
Yeah.
There should be a public broadcasting.
Yeah.
Train driver that got me here
Because it's
yesterday.
going to be used as material for future artwork, I guess.
Well, from what I understand, and this is having had no direct communication with Lara, just through what Sam said, is that these conversations are designed to be part of Lara's archive, and there is a kind of ambition to publish them in some form. The way Sam spoke about it on Monday was as kind of redacted documents, as if they were coming from a kind of Cold War bunker.
So we can blacken out some parts.
Yeah.
Like in the WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of potentially the idea. Yeah.
We should blacken out everything.
Yeah, well, that's what I think.
It
Yeah.
links back into one of the notes I made near the beginning of this conversation. I remember being very struck by an interview with the English Situationist artist Ralph Rumney, where he's talking about, this is even back in the early noughties, and has only become more true now, that almost certainly we live in a world where, the vast majority of what we say and do is kind of like recorded and archived and monitored, but who's listening to it all? And this feels like a kind of a microcosm of that. We're going to record these kind of, 3-hour plus conversations, but there's only one person at the other end who's going to be kind of passing
But
it.
it would be very different, for instance, to erase a file right now by pushing a button.
Yeah.
And to ask somebody to write down and to blacken out later.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be the result would be the same non-access to it. But that would be very different in terms of practices.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that came up in the conversation with Sam, was about the process, and I think you mentioned it earlier as well, about these kind of very, very deliberate and kind of complex structuring of things that whose eventual kind of product is opaque or not even that visible, or not even, potentially not there, removed from the situation. And you're right. That's a focus on a process rather than, like you say, just getting rid of it now. Very, very different thing. Yeah.
We could be even more nastier. We could say that we're gonna just stop talking for a while, but we will come back.
And then you don't come back.
And so they have to listen to it extensively.
Well, that's kind of like those old hidden tracks on CDs, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you'd know they were there immediately, because the last track would be sort of like 29 minutes long, and the song would finish after like 4 minutes, and you'd think, well, there's clearly something else here, so you'd skip it along. So it was sort of hidden
But
and not
if
hidden.
you go too fast forward, you miss it. We are allowed to have like a 1 second intervention, which is of course very meaningful.
Although presumably, this will be, put onto a computer and then played back through some sort of media player where you can just click along the line,
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
and you can just click until you find
You can see where.
sound.
Yeah.
You
can
can put it in
see
some
sound,
audio transcription or
Yeah.
some audio editing program.
But we can trick it
Yeah.
by producing noises.
Yeah. Or, we could leave a recording of some other conversation playing next to the microphone.
Or we could record the recorder.
Yeah.
Record the recorder.
Wow, meta,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which would be silent but present.
Yeah.
I don't know, that feels to me like a good place to stop. I feel like I've run out of things to say.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. Knock it on the head, call it a day.
Great. I think 3 hours is
It's a fair chunk of time.
is more or less my limit.
I think we covered some good stuff there. Some
Yeah,
interesting
absolutely.
things. And you're given a kind of keyword, a set of other words, and thrown into a room together. I think hopefully it proves to be interesting.
We didn't kill each other. Maybe we
No?
passed.
That was quite good tempered, I thought.
Yeah.
Passionate disagreements, even.
Right.
Amazing.
Should we just leave that running now?
Do we leave it on? Yeah. Are you going back tonight, Frank?
Yes, even maybe earlier, in fact. Because I thought I would leave at 5, but it's 3. Maybe I can catch earlier train. Maybe. And be at home earlier.
A little bit earlier, yeah.
Yesterday I arrived here at 1:30 in the morning.
Oh,
So
wow.
I wouldn't mind to be at home.
So you're taking the Eurostar tonight?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can all be on the train with Sam then.
But he lives at 3, no?
I thought you said 4, but
Oh, he
maybe
said
I've got that
4,
wrong.
You did say 4, yeah.
Oh, okay. Could be an option.
You're not going terribly far, presumably.
No, I've got to go up to campus. A couple of bits to do up there, and then that's it. I'm gonna head home after that.
So about the preparation of the event, you all knew Sam before? No?
So as I was saying before, I organised some study sessions here.
Here.
As part of, I did a research placement at Contemporary for a year.
Okay.
That ended in July of this year. As part of that placement, I put on 5 kind of study sessions, so 2-hour slots with a couple of texts and some ideas based around opacity, anonymity, kind of heteronymity in Pessoa, people like that, kind of, excess in Pessoa, that sort of stuff. And yeah, so that's how kind of I think I got involved.
So it totally
because
made
of that.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm familiar with the institution and Sam and Angelica, yeah.
And you?
Do
Do you have any idea how?
I think it wasn't supposed to be me. It was supposed to be someone else who sort of threw my name into contention.
Because that person wasn't
available, or yeah.
so she gave your name.
Yeah, but I just
That's-
got an email.
yeah,
about
that's
it,
quite
wasn't a
literally-
conversation.
all I know.
Yeah, I don't know much more than that either. But yeah, I mean, they gave me a few dates that I couldn't do. So they were quite keen to have me, I
But
guess.
you knew them before?
Sam, I've met like once, I think. I sort of recognise his face. I think he might be friends with another friend of mine in Manchester, but otherwise, no.
And I met Sam 5 years ago when he curated a show in France in a very small art center between Nancy and Metz
Okay.
about, it was called Schizophrenia. It's like artist working with sound.
Yeah.
But I hadn't heard from him since, let's say, 4 years.
Right, right.
Yeah. And apparently this, because just a few things about the kind of background that I do know, but I only found out on Monday, because I thought, well, I probably you've got these brackets with chair in there, like, I seem to be given this kind of responsibility for some kind of structure in this thing, right? And so I thought I'd better get a bit of background, so I phoned Sam and spoke to him. And it was, this room was one of the kind of influential factors in doing something like this as well. This kind of like sort of quasi-brutalist sort of space.
Yeah.
But it was also in the basement, directly below the roof, where the steam is coming off.
Yeah. Yeah, the location is very important for
Yeah, it's
The brain, or is it the gut?
I don't know, maybe.
I think we are lower than the gut,
With a bowel.
unfortunately. Yeah. We are at the end of the intestine.
Yeah. Yeah. Flatulence produced. Yeah. It's interesting.
They give us food and we produce.
Yeah. It's interesting actually because Sam mentioned as well that there were a lot of people that were approached and were a little reluctant because of the conditions, like not being told too much, there not being a public, it being recorded in this way, and
You see, I just thought great means to have too much prep.
yeah, I don't know. It's
That's
interesting.
what I thought was best about it as well.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to go anyway.
Very nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Very nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you. Yes.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah.
Take care.
Good luck.
You too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I quite like not knowing. I quite like the opacity sounds. I quite like,
Yeah, it's very comfortable.
in a way, yeah, in its
Yeah.
own way. It's, we always strive to know everything that there is to know because we
Yeah.
find that comfortable. But not knowing can be equally.
Yeah. No, for me the issue was more that it's far away. It's
Yeah,
5 hours
sure,
of
yeah.
train, so it means that I lose 2 days. 1 day to come, 1 day to go back. So it's a little painful. Like for a few hours, you lose 3 days. In fact.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you couldn't do it on Skype, I suppose.
No, I think it wouldn't work, would it?
That wouldn't
No,
work.
but I thought that it would be more practical for them to work with people who live in Nottingham directly. It's or in London or in.
But if they mentioned that they're not going to advertise and that everything is going to be word of mouth. So if it's all
Yeah,
people from Nottingham, then
Yeah,
it
that's-
might not
yeah, you're right.
get
Yeah,
known
the
quite
you
so
don't know
well.
where the word to mouth will lead you.
Yeah,
lead
yeah.
you.
I'm still thinking about this whole idea of like the transcript being written out and then totally redacted as a kind of this presence and absence,
Yeah.
which I think is really interesting. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about an artist called Jill Majid, who spent time with the Dutch Secret Service and was given access and interviewed, but was obviously not allowed to produce kind of any of the transcripts or stuff like that for reasons of national security or whatever, and all of the interviewees, the spies and whatnot, and spoke to her under conditions of pseudonymities. They spoke with a different name, and so one of the things that there's an article by an academic called Claire Birchall reflects on is this idea of an aesthetics of the secret.
Yeah.
So how do you give form to something that is
Yeah.
secretive? And so a lot of these so in the exhibition, if I remember correctly from the paper, it was a series of kind of neon signs that sort of had like slight kind of markers about the shape of somebody's nose or like a word that somebody might have uttered. So again, we've got this sense of visibility that points to a fundamental like sense of opacity in a weird way.
Yeah.
And there's something interesting doing the same kind of thing.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, that would be my
Yeah.
my proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's...
There is a very funny paper by Peter Gallison, who's a science historian,
Okay,
and he talks about the classified documents in the US.
yeah.
Every year, they produce, this paper?
No.
They produce the equivalent of the Library of Congress in terms of classified
Wow.
documents. So the main problem is not how to keep it secret, is how to store
How to
things.
store it, yeah.
So every year,
Yeah.
they have to unclassified or to declassified files in order to make room for the new ones.
Wow.
But who is going to decide which documents you're going to declassify? So they have to set up a commission, but the process of selecting this commission is kept secret. And they have to when you set up a commission, it means you have to produce reports on that
So it's
because
more-
you work in a legal frame. So
Yeah,
as soon as you're in a legal
yeah.
frame, you produce
Yeah.
reports.
Bureaucracy, yeah.
Bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So they produce confidential reports
Which has to be secret.
about
It has to be stored somewhere.
about a commission which
Wow,
will be
that's-
allowed to unclassified, and this commission has to also produce reports about why did they decided to declassify these files,
Yeah, wow, that sounds amazing.
and these reports are also confidential.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So you have a big economy, in fact,
Yeah, that you never see.
a big trade of.
But I do like this idea of kind of, there's Trevor Paglin's
Yeah,
project of limit telephotography, of the secret bases, and the actual end of the capabilities of photography. It's a great project, you know, how do you render the secrecy
yeah.
or invisibility or whatever into form? Like, there's something nice about that. So, yeah, maybe this could be another example.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
these, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.